The ancient foundations, 8500 BCE, 300 CE. Scotland's story is one of remarkable resilience and cultural synthesis. From the enigmatic Pictish stones that still dot the landscapes of Aberdeenshire to the vibrant urban centres of Glasgow and Edinburgh, Scotland's historical journey spans millennia of cultural evolution, political transformation, and human innovation. The ancient foundations, 8500 BCE, 300 CE, long before the kingdoms and clans that would shape medieval Scotland, the rugged landscapes between the Atlantic and the North Sea were home to successive waves of prehistoric peoples. Their story, revealed through archaeology rather than written records, forms the foundation upon which Scotland's later history would build. The First Scots. The earliest evidence of human habitation in Scotland dates to approximately 8500 BCE, as the last ice age retreated and the land became hospitable. These Mesolithic hunter-gatherers left traces of their presence in temporary encampments, most notably at sites like Cramond near Edinburgh and on the Isle of Rum, where shell middens demonstrate their reliance on coastal resources. These were a mobile people, notes archaeologist Caroline Wickham-Jones, travelling light but with sophisticated knowledge of their environment, following seasonal patterns of animal migration and plant availability. Archaeological discoveries illuminate their daily lives. At Biggar in South Lanarkshire, a settlement dated to approximately 12,000 BCE reveals stone tools finely crafted from local materials. The earliest house structure identified in Britain stands at South Queensferry, an oval arrangement of wooden posts dating to around 8240 BCE that likely supported a skin or thatch covering. Agricultural revolution. Around 4000 BCE, farming communities began to transform Scotland's landscape, marking the transition to the Neolithic period. These settlers brought domesticated animals and crop cultivation from continental Europe, establishing permanent settlements that fundamentally changed human relationships with the land. The Orkney Islands preserve remarkable evidence of these early farming communities. At Knap of Hower on Papa Westray stands Britain's oldest preserved stone house, dating to approximately 3500 BCE, a testament to the durability of these early structures. Even more impressive is Skara Brae, a complete Neolithic village preserved by sand until its discovery following a storm in 1850. Its stone furniture, storage spaces, and sophisticated drainage system reveal a well-organized agricultural society. These Neolithic communities possessed profound spiritual beliefs, evidenced by their monumental ceremonial structures. The chambered cairn at Maeshowe, dating from around 3000 BCE, demonstrates remarkable architectural skill, built to align with the winter solstice sunset when light illuminates the inner chamber. The stone circles at Stennis and nearby Ring of Brodgar suggest complex ceremonial practices, rivaling better-known monuments like Stonehenge. Monuments and meaning. The Neolithic transformation extended beyond mere subsistence farming. Recent archaeological interpretations suggest these monumental structures served as focal points for communal identity, marking territorial boundaries and embodying cosmological beliefs. Excavations at Ness of Brodgar in Orkney have uncovered a massive temple complex that operated for over a millennium, challenging our understanding of prehistoric social organization. What we're seeing, explains archaeologist Colin Richards, is evidence for complex stratified societies capable of marshalling significant labor forces and specialized craftspeople. These monuments weren't built by simple farmers, but by sophisticated communities with shared religious beliefs. The carved stone balls found throughout northeast Scotland, perfectly spherical objects with protruding knobs arranged with mathematical precision, suggest advanced abstract thinking. Over 425 examples have been discovered, primarily dating to the late Neolithic period, with the Towie ball from Aberdeenshire showing remarkable craftsmanship in its intricate spiral carvings. Bronze Age transformations. Around 2000 BCE, the introduction of metalworking heralded the Bronze Age in Scotland. This technological revolution, first copper, then bronze, an alloy of copper and tin, transformed tools, weapons, and social hierarchies. Bronze objects required specialized knowledge and access to metal ores, creating new forms of wealth and status differentiation. Excavations at Jarlshof in Shetland reveal the evolution of domestic architecture during this period. Oval stone houses with central hearths gradually replaced earlier wooden structures. The creation of bronze required long-distance trade networks. Tin from Cornwall and copper from Ireland or central Scotland had to be brought together, suggesting complex economic exchanges. Burial practices also evolved, with individual interments replacing the communal burials of the Neolithic. Food vessels and beakers, distinctive pottery styles, often containing remnants of alcoholic beverages, accompanied the dead, suggesting elaborate funerary rituals. The remarkable preservation of the Orkney Venus, or Westray wife, Scotland's earliest known human representation, carved around 3000 BCE, offers rare insight into symbolic expression. Iron Age societies, from approximately 700 BCE, iron technology spread across Scotland, bringing stronger tools, more effective weapons, and further social change. The archaeological record shows increasing defensive concerns, with hill-fort construction intensifying across southern Scotland. Traprain law in East Lothian, occupied from around 1000 BCE, could accommodate several hundred houses within its defensive perimeter. In northern Scotland, brocks, massive dry stone towers with double walls, began appearing around 200 BCE. These impressive structures, unique to Scotland, combined defensive capabilities with statements of prestige. Mousa Broch in Shetland still stands over 13 meters tall, its walls containing galleries and chambers between inner and outer faces in a sophisticated architectural achievement. The Brochs represent a distinctive architectural tradition, observes archaeologist Ian Armitt. They may have housed single elite families or small communities, but what's clear is that they represent significant investments of labor and engineering knowledge. Loch-dwelling settlements called crannogs, artificial islands supporting wooden roundhouses, provided another defensive option. These ingenious structures, accessible only by boat or causeway, offered security against both human and animal threats. Excavations at Oakbank Crannog on Loch Tay have yielded extraordinarily well-preserved organic materials, including wooden utensils, food remains, and textiles, providing rare glimpses into daily Iron Age life. Trade and communication. Despite Scotland's seemingly remote position, archaeological evidence confirms extensive trade connections throughout prehistory. Baltic amber appears in Scottish Bronze Age burials. Mediterranean glass beads reach Iron Age settlements. The distinctive grotesque style of Celtic art that developed in Scotland during the Iron Age shows influences from across Europe while maintaining distinctively local expressions. By the time Roman legions approached Scotland's borders in the 1st century CE, they encountered a mosaic of tribal societies with developed agricultural systems, craft specialization, and complex social hierarchies. Classical writers like Tacitus would describe them as Caledonian peoples, though their self-identifications likely differed significantly. These communities would soon face the most powerful empire of the ancient world, beginning Scotland's documented history. Rome's northern frontier, 43 CE 410 CE. While much of Britain fell under Roman dominion for nearly 4 centuries, Scotland's story followed a different path, one of resistance, limited occupation, and cultural preservation that would profoundly shape its future development. The Roman experience in Caledonia, as they called Scotland, was defined more by what they failed to achieve than by what they conquered. Long before Roman legions reached Scotland's borders, Greek explorers had ventured into northern waters. Around 325 BCE, Pythias of Massalia circumnavigated Britain, naming the northernmost point Orcas, Orkney. His accounts, though largely lost, filtered into later Greek and Roman geographical knowledge. By the time of Pliny the Elder, d. 79 CE, Roman awareness had extended to Dumna, likely the Outer Hebrides, and the Caledonian Forest, though actual contact remained minimal. The geographer Ptolemy, writing in the 2nd century CE, identified 18 tribal territories across Scotland. His map, while increasingly inaccurate in the north and west, named groups including the Votadini around Edinburgh, the Novantae in Galloway, and the Caledoni in the Central Highlands, providing our first glimpse of Scotland's tribal mosaic. Roman Britain formally began with the Claudian invasion of 43 CE, but nearly 3 decades passed before the frontier pushed significantly northward. In 71 CE, Governor Quintus Petilius Cerialis launched preliminary campaigns into southern Scotland, establishing bases and gathering intelligence. The decisive push came under Gnaeus Julius Agricola, governor from 78 to 84 CE, whose campaigns were chronicled by his son-in-law, the historian Tacitus. Agricola's strategy combined military might with diplomatic persuasion. As Tacitus records, he trained the sons of chieftains in the liberal arts, so that those who once rejected the Latin language now coveted eloquence. By 79 CE, Roman forces secured the Scottish lowlands, building forts at strategic locations, including Tremontium, Newstead, and Inchtoothill, an imposing legionary fortress that could house 5,000 troops. The culmination came in 84 CE at Mons Graupius, where Agricola defeated a Caledonian confederation reportedly led by a chieftain named Calgacus. Tacitus attributes to Calgacus a stirring speech condemning Roman imperialism. They create desolation and call it peace. While likely invented, this sentiment captures the fierce resistance Rome encountered. Despite victory, the Romans never fully capitalized on this success. Within a few years, troops were withdrawn southward to address crises elsewhere in the empire. Rome's inability to control northern Scotland led to a defensive strategy embodied in 2 massive frontier walls. Emperor Hadrian ordered the first in 122 CE, a stone barrier spanning 73 miles, 117 km, from Wallsend to the Solway Firth, with mile castles, forts, and a complex system of ditches. This engineering marvel represented the empire's northern limit. In 142 CE, under Emperor Antoninus Pius, the frontier temporarily advanced northward with the construction of the Antonine Wall, a 37-mile, 60 kilometers turf rampart reinforced with timber and fronted by a massive ditch between the firths of Forth and Clyde. This represented Rome's maximum advance in Scotland, effectively annexing the fertile lowlands. Archaeological excavations reveal the wall's sophisticated design, with 19 forts spaced at 2-mile intervals and elaborate distance slabs commemorating sections built by different legions. The slab's triumphalist imagery celebrates the conquest of barbarian tribes, though reality proved more complex. After barely 20 years, Rome abandoned the Antonine Wall, retreating to Hadrian's Wall by 164 CE, a tacit admission that holding southern Scotland was too costly. Roman accounts emphasize the otherness of the Caledonians. Tacitus described them as red-haired, large-limbed people who fought with long swords and small shields, utilizing chariots in battle. Dio Cassius, writing later, claimed they dwell in tents, naked and unshod, possessing their women in common, and rear all offspring together. Such ethnographic descriptions often said more about Roman cultural prejudices than about the Caledonians themselves. Archaeological evidence paints a more nuanced picture of Iron Age Scottish society. Excavations at native settlements, contemporary with Roman occupation, reveal sophisticated roundhouses, advanced metalworking, and extensive trade networks. Roman goods, pottery, glassware, coins, appear at native sites far beyond the frontier, suggesting complex economic and diplomatic relationships rather than simple hostility. The Romans called these northern peoples Caledonians initially, later referring to them as Picti, painted people, the first mention of what would become known as the Picts. This name change, first appearing in Roman sources around 297 CE, may reflect cultural shifts among the northern tribes or simply evolving Roman perceptions. Rome's most determined effort to conquer Scotland came under Emperor Septimius Severus in 210 CE. Leading an enormous invasion force, reportedly numbering 40,000 troops, Severus drove deep into the highlands. As Dio Cassius records, he cut down forests, leveled hills, filled marshes, and bridged rivers in a brutal campaign of attrition. Despite this massive effort, Severus achieved no lasting conquest. Native resistance continued through guerrilla tactics, avoiding pitched battles while harassing supply lines and isolated units. When Severus died at York in 201 CE, his son Caracalla quickly abandoned the campaign and withdrew to Hadrian's Wall, which remained Rome's northern frontier until imperial collapse. The late Roman period saw increasing pressure on Britain's frontiers. In 367 CE, the barbarian conspiracy saw coordinated attacks by Picts, Irish, Scoti, and Saxons that temporarily overwhelmed Roman defences. After the brief recovery under Count Theodosius, Roman military presence gradually diminished until the final withdrawal of legions around 410 CE. Rome's impact on Scotland was significantly less profound than in southern Britain. North of Hadrian's Wall, Roman cultural influence remained superficial. No towns developed, Latin never displaced native languages, and Christianity made few inroads during the Roman period. As archaeologist Gordon Maxwell observes, Roman artifacts are found on native sites, but native cultural patterns continued largely unchanged. Yet the Roman period was not without consequences. The experience of resistance likely accelerated political consolidation among native groups. Roman sources initially described numerous small tribes, but later referred to larger confederations, suggesting increasing unity in response to external threat. The very concept of Picti as a collective identity may have emerged partly through opposition to Rome. The Romans also inadvertently shaped Scotland's future by their withdrawal. The power vacuum created opportunities for new political formations, including the gradual emergence of Pictish kingdoms in the north and Brittonic kingdoms like Strathclyde in the south. Meanwhile, the collapse of Roman Britain opened Scotland's western coast to Irish settlement, beginning the Gaelic presence that would profoundly influence Scottish history. As Rome's shadow receded from Britain in the early 5th century, Scotland stood poised at the threshold of a new era, one defined not by foreign imperialism, but by indigenous development and cultural cross-fertilization between Pictish, Brittonic, and Gaelic societies. 4 kingdoms, post-Roman Scotland, 410, CE 800 CE. As the last Roman legions withdrew from Britain around 410 CE, they left behind a power vacuum that would reshape Scotland's political landscape. 4 distinct cultural and political entities emerged during this pivotal period, each contributing to the complex tapestry of early medieval Scottish identity. This era, though often termed Dark Ages due to limited written sources, was actually a time of dynamic cultural formation and interaction. The Picts, having successfully resisted Roman domination, emerged as the dominant power in eastern and northern Scotland. Archaeological evidence and the limited textual sources suggest they were not a single unified kingdom, but a confederation of provinces or sub-kingdoms. By the late 6th century, the kingdom of Fortriu, centered around modern Strathearn and Menteith, had emerged as the dominant Pictish power. The Pictish cultural legacy is preserved most dramatically in their elaborately carved standing stones. These monuments, like the magnificent examples at Aberlemno and the Clach and Tiompine in Strathpeffer, feature intricate symbols alongside hunting scenes and, in later periods, Christian imagery. The recurring symbols, crescents, V-rods, double discs, and enigmatic animal representations likely conveyed political, religious, or genealogical information now lost to us. Recent archaeological work by the University of Aberdeen's Northern Picts project has revealed the scale and sophistication of Pictish power centres. Excavations at Rhynie in Aberdeenshire uncovered a fortified settlement with evidence of metalworking, long-distance trade connections, and imported luxury goods, challenging older notions of Pictish isolation. The Picts have often been cast as mysterious barbarians, notes archaeologist Gordon Noble, but the evidence shows they maintained sophisticated political systems and artistic traditions comparable to their contemporaries across Europe. In western Scotland, Gaelic-speaking settlers from northeastern Ireland established the kingdom of Dalriata by the late 5th century, with its royal centre at Dunad, a dramatic rocky outcrop in Argyll. Dalriata maintained close connections with Ireland while developing distinct Scottish characteristics. The 7th century text Cencius Fer Nalban, History of the Men of Scotland, records the kingdom's 3 main kindreds or tribes, the Senel and Gabrain, Senel Lo Eiron, and Senel Noengusa. Archaeological excavations at Dunad reveal evidence of royal inauguration ceremonies, including a footprint carved into stone where kings may have stood during coronation rituals. The fortress yielded evidence of high-status craftsmanship in gold, silver, and bronze, along with imported Mediterranean pottery, demonstrating Dalriata's extensive maritime trade networks. Gaelic influence spread through military power, maritime commerce, and religious mission. Significantly, it was from Dalriata that the name Scot, Latin Scotti, would eventually extend to the entire country. Originally a Roman term for Irish raiders, it followed the Gaelic migrants to Scotland and gradually broadened in meaning. In southwestern Scotland, a Brittonic-speaking kingdom centred on the fortress of Ault Clut, Dumbarton Rock, maintained cultural connections with the other Brittonic territories of what had been Roman Britain. Often called Strathclyde after its central valley, this kingdom preserved British language and traditions while adapting to changing circumstances. The rock fortress of Dumbarton, a commanding volcanic plug at the confluence of the rivers Leven and Clyde, served as a virtually impregnable royal centre until its capture by Viking raiders in 870 CE. Archaeological finds demonstrate Strathclyde's participation in broader British trade networks and artistic traditions. The kingdom's people spoke a language closely related to Welsh, distinct from both Gaelic and Pictish. Place name evidence reveals Brittonic terminology throughout the region. Pen, head or hill, tref, settlement, and caer, fort, appear in locations like Penhuian, Troqueer, and Caer Laverock. The southeastern portions of modern Scotland fell under influence of the Anglian Kingdom of Bernicia, which later merged with Deira to form the powerful Northumbrian state. English rulers established control over territories previously inhabited by Brittonic populations, with Ida establishing his rule around 547 CE. Under King Oswald, 634–642 CE, and his successors, Northumbrian influence extended as far as the Firth of Forth, incorporating the former Votadini territory known to the Angles as Lothian. The monastery at Old Melrose, founded around 635 CE, exemplified Northumbrian cultural presence in southern Scotland. Archaeological investigations reveal this was not merely military occupation, but substantial settlement, with Anglo-Saxon place names persisting throughout southeastern Scotland. Settlements ending in Ham, Tun, and Wick reflect this linguistic and cultural frontier. Perhaps the most significant development during this period was Scotland's gradual conversion to Christianity, a process that followed different trajectories in each kingdom, while ultimately creating cultural connections between them. Three distinct strands of Christian influence converged in early medieval Scotland. Columba, an Irish noble who left his homeland in 563 CE, established a monastery on Iona that became the spiritual powerhouse of the region. From this small Hebridean island, Columba and his successors launched missions to the Picts and northern Anglo-Saxons. The Vita Columbae, Life of Columba, written by Adomnan around 697 CE, describes the saint's encounters with Pictish King Brede and various miraculous events. While in stories Columba often appears confronting pagan beliefs, explains historian Thomas Owen Clancy, the reality was likely more complex, a gradual process of accommodation and synthesis between Christian teachings and indigenous practices. The Brittonic kingdoms maintained Christian traditions that had survived from Roman times, influenced by developments in Wales and elsewhere in Britain. Meanwhile, the Anglican Church, following Augustine's Roman mission to Canterbury in 597 CE, established a distinct ecclesiastical organization connected to continental practices. These different Christian traditions sometimes clashed, most notably at the Synod of Whitby in 1664 CE, where King Oswiu of Northumbria chose to adopt Roman practices regarding the calculation of Easter rather than the Celtic method. Gradually, the independent Celtic traditions were incorporated into the Roman system, though distinctive practices persisted. Monasteries became centers of learning, art, and political influence. The extraordinary illuminated manuscripts produced in this period, such as the Book of Kells, likely created on Iona, represent the highest artistic achievements of their age. Stone crosses like those at Ruthwell demonstrate the synthesis of Christian imagery with native artistic traditions. Archaeological evidence provides glimpses into everyday existence during this period. Excavations at settlements like Buckquoy and Orkney reveal oval or rectangular houses with central hearths and stone furniture. Diet consisted primarily of barley, oats, cattle, sheep, pigs, and extensive maritime resources, including fish and shellfish. Distinctive jewelry and metalwork demonstrate sophisticated craftsmanship. Pictish metalworkers created intricate penannular brooches and fine silver chains, while similar high-status items appeared throughout all the kingdoms, suggesting shared aristocratic tastes transcending political boundaries. Trade connected Scotland with wider networks. Pottery from France, glass from the Rhineland, and coins from across Europe appear in aristocratic contexts. Wine, fine textiles, and other luxury goods reached even seemingly remote regions through established maritime and overland routes. By the late 8th century, as these four cultural political entities continued their complex interactions, a new force would arrive on Scotland's shores, Scandinavian raiders and settlers whose impact would dramatically reshape the cultural and political landscape. The Viking Age was about to dawn. The Birth of Alba, 840–1266 CE, from the fusion of Pictish and Gaelic kingdoms emerged a new political entity, Alba, that would eventually evolve into the medieval Kingdom of Scotland. This pivotal transformation occurred against a backdrop of Viking invasions, dynastic struggles, and cultural synthesis, fundamentally reshaping Scotland's political landscape and cultural identity. The traditional narrative of Scottish origins centres on Kenneth MacAlpin, who rose to power in the 840s. Medieval chroniclers portrayed him as conquering the Picts and establishing Gaelic dominance, but modern historians recognise a more complex process of cultural and political integration. Kenneth likely had both Pictish and Gaelic ancestry, positioning him to unite the two peoples. The infamous treachery of Scone, where Kenneth supposedly massacred Pictish nobles at a banquet, appears in later medieval chronicles but is likely apocryphal. Archaeological and documentary evidence suggests a gradual merger of kingdoms accelerated by external pressures, particularly Viking raids that devastated both Pictish and Gaelic territories. The rise of Kenneth MacAlpin represents not so much a Gaelic conquest of Pictish territories, argues historian Alex Wolfe, but rather the culmination of processes that had been underway for generations, creating a new political entity that was neither purely Pictish nor purely Gaelic. Kenneth established his dynasty, the House of Alpin, which ruled this emerging kingdom for over a century. The succession passed through multiple branches of the family amid periods of intense dynastic competition, reflecting the persistence of earlier practices where kingship was shared among eligible royal kinsmen rather than following strict primogeniture. The crucial period in the formation of the Scottish kingdom came during the lengthy reign of Constantine II, 900–942–3, grandson of Kenneth MacAlpin. His leadership crystallized the emerging Scottish identity, with contemporary sources first consistently using the term Re-Alban, King of Alba, during this period. Constantine faced the dual challenge of Viking incursions and Anglo-Saxon expansion. His kingdom was nearly encircled, with Vikings controlling much of northern Britain and the Isles, while the emerging English kingdom exerted pressure from the south. His diplomatic and military acumen maintained Alba's independence during this critical period. Religious reform formed another pillar of Constantine's legacy. He convened a council at Scone in 906, bringing ecclesiastical practices into closer alignment with broader European norms while preserving distinctive elements of Celtic Christianity. The establishment of the bishopric of St. Andrews further institutionalized the Scottish Church. Constantine's participation in the disastrous Battle of Brunanburh, 937, against Aethelstan of England marked a turning point. The Scots-Norse coalition suffered a crushing defeat, commemorated in the famous Anglo-Saxon poem that celebrates how the field grew slick with warriors' blood. Shortly afterward, Constantine retired to the monastery at St. Andrews, where he spent his final years as a religious contemplative, a remarkable conclusion to a transformative reign. The period between Constantine's abdication and the accession of Malcolm II in 1005 witnessed continued consolidation of Alba's territory. Malcolm I, 943–954, notably annexed the Brittonic kingdom of Strathclyde, as part of a strategic agreement with King Edmund of England, significantly expanding Alba's southwestern frontier. This acquisition was balanced by setbacks in Moray, where local rulers maintained semi-independent status. Dynastic stability remained elusive, with violent succession disputes characterizing the era. As the annals of Ulster tersely record, Dub, son of Malcolm, King of Alba, was killed by the men of Alba themselves, a fate that befell multiple rulers during this turbulent period. The reign of Malcolm II, 1005–1034, proved particularly consequential. His victory at Carham, 1018, against Northumbria secured Alba's permanent control over Lothian, integrating these fertile southeastern territories with their Anglo-Saxon cultural influences into the kingdom. This expansion brought the boundaries of Alba close to their modern configuration. Malcolm II's achievements were profound, notes historian Benjamin Hudson. By his death, the kingdom had secured its southern boundaries, established dynastic marriage alliances, and consolidated royal authority across disparate territories. The succession of Duncan I, 1034–1040, Malcolm II's grandson through his daughter, marked a shift toward primogeniture inheritance but proved short-lived. Duncan's military failures, particularly a disastrous campaign against Durham, undermined his authority. In 1040 he was defeated and killed by Macbeth, Mormaer, provincial ruler of Moray, and likewise a grandson of Malcolm II through marriage. Shakespeare's portrayal of Macbeth as a villainous usurper bears little resemblance to historical reality. Contemporary sources suggest Macbeth ruled effectively for 17 years, 1040–1057, maintaining stability and even undertaking a pilgrimage to Rome in 1050. Hardly the behavior of an insecure tyrant. The Dwan Albanach, a medieval Gaelic poem, describes him simply as the Red King, brave of judgments. Macbeth's defeat by Duncan's son Malcolm at Lumphanan in 1057 marked the end of this brief dynastic interruption. After a short transition under Macbeth's stepson Lulach, Malcolm III secured the throne, establishing the long-lived Canmore dynasty that would rule Scotland for the next 2 centuries. Malcolm III. Canmore, 1058–1093, significantly reoriented Scotland's relationships with its neighbours. His second marriage to the Anglo-Hungarian Princess Margaret, later canonized as Saint Margaret, proved particularly consequential. A descendant of the Anglo-Saxon royal house forced into exile by the Norman conquest, Margaret brought continental influences to the Scottish court. The Life of St. Margaret, written by her confessor Turgot, portrays her as a civilizing influence who reformed religious practices and elevated court culture. Margaret established the ferry across the Forth, giving us Queensferry, founded Dunfermline Abbey, and promoted ecclesiastical reforms aligning Scottish practices with continental norms. The magnificent gospel book associated with her, now in the Bodleian Library, testifies to her sophisticated tastes and learning. Malcolm's repeated raids into northern England provoked William the Conqueror to march north in 1072, culminating in the Treaty of Abernethy, where Malcolm became William's vassal. This submission, though interpreted differently by both parties, established a precedent that English monarchs would later exploit to claim overlordship of Scotland. Malcolm's death during a raid on Northumbria in 1093 triggered a succession crisis. His brother Donald III seized power, championing traditional Celtic customs against the growing Anglo-Norman influence. This cultural tension shaped subsequent succession struggles as Malcolm's sons by different marriages competed for the throne, often with English backing. The accession of David the Verne, 1124–1153, Margaret's youngest son, marked a watershed in Scottish history. Having spent his formative years at the English court and holding extensive lands in England, David brought Anglo-Norman institutions and followers north when he claimed the Scottish throne. The Davidian Revolution, as historian G.W.S. Barrow termed it, fundamentally transformed Scotland's governance and society. David introduced feudal land tenure, established sheriffdoms for local administration, appointed justiciars to oversee royal justice, and created a chancery to handle royal documents. The first Scottish royal coinage appeared under his rule, facilitating commerce. David's charter to the burgesses of Edinburgh, which granted them commercial monopolies and self-governance, exemplifies his economic policies. Similar royal burghs, established across Scotland, fostered urban development and international trade. The burghs' standardised layouts, with a central marketplace and regular plots, are still visible in many Scottish town centres today. The stone castles constructed during this period, most now visible only as archaeological remains, physically embodied the new power structures. Imports of luxury goods increased, visible in archaeological assemblages showing French pottery, Baltic amber and Mediterranean glass. David's religious patronage proved equally significant. As the Chronicle of Melrose recorded, he found 3 bishoprics and left 9, reflecting his systematic reorganization of the Scottish Church into territorial dioceses. Spectacular abbeys founded during his reign, including Melrose, Holyrood and Jedburgh, brought continental monastic orders to Scotland and created enduring architectural masterpieces. David the Furs, observes historian Richard Oram, created the framework within which medieval Scottish kingship would operate for the next 2 centuries, establishing institutions that balanced native traditions with imported Anglo-Norman practices. David's successors, his grandson Malcolm V, 1153–1165, and great-grandson William I the Lion, 1165–1214, continued his policies despite periods of tension with England. William's capture at Alnwick in 1174 forced him to acknowledge English overlordship in the Treaty of Falaise, though this humiliating submission was later nullified by Richard I of England in exchange for financial contribution to his crusade. The 13th century witnessed Scotland's transition from a composite kingdom to a more unified realm. Alexander II, 1214–1249, and Alexander III, 1249–1286, skillfully consolidated royal authority while avoiding major conflicts with England. Their diplomacy and occasional military pressure expanded Scottish control into the Western Highlands and Islands, previously under Norse influence. The culmination came with the Treaty of Perth in 1266, when Alexander III negotiated with King Magnus VI of Norway to purchase sovereignty over the Hebrides and Isle of Man for 4,000 marks with an annual payment of 100 marks. The treaty ended centuries of Norse control over Scotland's western seaboard, integrating these strategically vital territories into the kingdom. By Alexander III's reign, the transformed Kingdom of Alba, now increasingly referred to as Scotia or Scotland, had achieved remarkable cohesion and prosperity. The king's tragic death in 1286, riding in a storm to visit his new bride, would trigger a succession crisis that threatened everything his predecessors had built. The golden age of medieval Scottish independence was drawing to a close, with the Wars of Independence looming on the horizon. The Wars of Independence, 1286–1356. The death of Alexander III in 1286 marked the end of Scotland's golden age and the beginning of a tumultuous period that would fundamentally reshape Scottish identity. The ensuing Wars of Independence against England forged a fierce commitment to sovereignty that has remained central to Scottish national consciousness ever since. As contemporary chronicler John of Fordun observed, this era transformed a people who formerly were of the utmost gentleness into a race untamed and most savage toward the English people. On a stormy March night in 1286, King Alexander III rode along the coastal path from Edinburgh toward Kinghorn, eager to reunite with his young bride, Yolande of Dreux. When his body was discovered the following morning beneath the cliffs, Scotland faced an immediate succession crisis. Alexander's children from his first marriage had all predeceased him, leaving only his 3-year-old granddaughter Margaret, the Maid of Norway, as heir. The guardians of Scotland, prominent nobles appointed to govern during Margaret's minority, negotiated the Treaty of Berghem in 1290, arranging her marriage to Edward I of England's son, while carefully preserving Scottish independence. As the chronicler Bauer later wrote, in this treaty it was recognised, affirmed and conceded by the King of England that the Kingdom of Scotland should remain separate and divided from England according to its rightful boundaries, free in itself and without subjection. These careful arrangements collapsed when the young queen died in Orkney en route from Norway. With Margaret's death, 14 rival claimants emerged, most prominently John Balliol and Robert Bruce of Annandale. To avert civil war, Scottish magnates invited Edward VI of England to arbitrate, a fateful decision that would have disastrous consequences. Edward seized this opportunity to advance long-standing English claims of overlordship. Before adjudicating the succession, he demanded recognition that Scotland was held as a feudal dependency of England, a concession the Scottish nobles reluctantly provided, believing it a temporary measure. After a quasi-judicial process known as the Great Cause, Edward selected John Balliol, who possessed the strongest hereditary claim through primogeniture. Balliol was enthroned at Scone in November 1292, but his position quickly became untenable as Edward systematically undermined his authority, demanding Scottish military service and treating Scotland as a vassal state. As historian Ranald Nicholson notes, Edward turned what had been a theoretical feudal superiority into an active administrative subjection. Edward's humiliations of King John included summoning him repeatedly to English courts and dismissing his objections with the infamous remark, "The foolish traitor, does he not realize that I have the means of bringing him back?" By 1295, pressured by his increasingly alienated nobles, John entered a defensive alliance with France, the beginning of the Old Alliance that would shape Scottish foreign policy for centuries. Edward's response was swift and brutal. In March 1296, his forces sacked Berwick, massacring thousands of inhabitants in what contemporaries called the greatest single atrocity of the Wars of Independence. After defeating the Scottish army at Dunbar, Edward systematically subjugated Scotland, forcing John Balliol's abdication and removing the Stone of Destiny, upon which Scottish kings were traditionally crowned, to Westminster Abbey. The English king's campaign was so thorough that he earned the title Hammer of the Scots. What began as aristocratic resistance to Edward's overlordship transformed into a wider popular movement when William Wallace emerged as a leader in 1297. The son of a minor landholder, Wallace's exact background remains obscure, but his tactical brilliance and charismatic leadership inspired widespread support. Joining forces with Andrew Moray, another resistance leader from northern Scotland, Wallace achieved a stunning victory at Stirling Bridge in September 1297. The battle showcased Wallace's tactical genius, allowing a portion of the English army to cross the narrow bridge before attacking, trapping them between the Scottish forces and the River Forth. As English chronicler Walter of Guisborough recounted, the Scots saw the English discomfited and immediately running down the hill like a melting glacier. They slaughtered the English from the highest to the lowest. Following this victory, Wallace was appointed Guardian of Scotland, governing in the name of the exiled John Balliol. Records of his brief administration show attempts to reorganize trade with continental Europe and restore normal governance. A letter from Wallace to the merchants of Lubeck and Hamburg, preserved in German archives, demonstrates his diplomatic efforts to revive Scotland's economy. Edward the Fern personally led a massive army north in 1298, confronting Wallace at Falkirk. Despite innovative tactical arrangements, Wallace's infantry formed circular schiltrons, bristling with spears. The Scottish forces were overwhelmed by English longbowmen and heavy cavalry. The defeat forced Wallace to resign as Guardian, though he continued guerrilla resistance until his capture in 1305. Wallace's execution in London was deliberately gruesome, hanged, drawn, and quartered as a traitor, despite his insistence that he had never sworn allegiance to Edward. The English king displayed Wallace's quartered body in Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling, and Perth as a warning. Instead, Wallace became Scotland's first national martyr, his memory inspiring continued resistance. The mantle of resistance passed to nobles, including John Comyn and Robert Bruce, grandson of the earlier claimant. Their rivalry complicated Scotland's leadership until February 10, 1306, when Bruce fatally stabbed Comyn at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries. This shocking act of violence in a consecrated space led to Bruce's excommunication, but also cleared his path to the throne. On March 25, 1306, Bruce was hastily crowned at Scone. His early reign proved disastrous. Defeated at Methven, his family captured, and his supporters executed. The king became a fugitive in his own realm. According to tradition, while hiding in a cave on Rathlin Island, Bruce observed a spider repeatedly attempting to spin its web, despite multiple failures. Inspired by this persistence, he resolved to continue his struggle. Bruce proved a masterful guerrilla leader, gradually rebuilding his forces and recapturing castles across Scotland. His growing reputation for chivalry and military acumen attracted increasing support. By 1313, only Stirling Castle remained under English control, with Edward Bruce, the king's brother, laying siege to the fortress. When the garrison commander at Stirling agreed to surrender if not relieved by Midsummer's Day 1314, Edward II of England was forced to act. Leading one of the largest armies ever assembled in medieval Britain, estimated at 20,000 men including heavy cavalry and Welsh longbowmen, Edward marched north to break the siege. Bruce, commanding approximately 7,000 men, prepared the ground carefully, selecting a field near Bannockburn where the English army's numerical advantage would be neutralized by marshy terrain and narrow approaches. On June 23–24, 1314, the armies clashed in what became Scotland's most celebrated military victory. The battle's turning point came when English knights, attempting to outflank the Scottish position, became disorganized in difficult terrain. Bruce's infantry schiltrons, densely packed formations of spearmen, repelled repeated cavalry charges. As one English chronicler lamented, "Alas, on that day, English honor was lost, and the boast of English pride was humbled." Edward II barely escaped capture, fleeing to Dunbar and then by ship to England. Bannockburn did not immediately secure peace, but it established Bruce's authority and transformed the conflict. Scottish raids into northern England generated funds for the war effort through ransoms and plunder. Bruce's forces captured Berwick in 1318 and expanded the conflict into Ireland, where Edward Bruce, Robert's brother, briefly claimed the high kingship before his death in battle in 1318. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the independence period came not from battle, but through diplomacy. In 1320, Scottish nobles sent a letter to Pope John V, seeking to counter English claims of suzerainty and persuade the pontiff to recognize Scotland's independence. This document, now known as the Declaration of Arbroath, remains one of the most eloquent statements of national sovereignty in Western history. The Declaration's most famous passage asserts a remarkable principle of conditional monarchy. Yet if he, King Robert, should give up what he has begun, seeking to make us or our kingdom subject to the King of England or the English, we would strive at once to drive him out as our enemy and a subverter of his own right and ours, and we would make some other man who was able to defend us our king. This assertion that royal authority derives from the people and depends on the defense of national independence represents a striking articulation of political principles that would not become widespread for centuries. The Declaration persuaded Pope John to recognize Bruce as rightful king and lift the excommunication that had shadowed his reign since Comyn's murder. The wars accelerated the development of distinctly Scottish institutions. In 1326, what many historians consider the first full Parliament of Scotland convened, including representatives from the burghs, alongside nobles and clergy, to form the Three Estates. This inclusive approach to governance reflected the broad support needed to maintain independence. Robert I reorganized landholding through extensive redistributions to loyal supporters, fundamentally reshaping Scotland's nobility. The Bruce faction that emerged from these grants would dominate Scottish politics for generations. Royal administration expanded through the appointment of sheriffs and justiciars, while the Exchequer managed increasing royal revenues. The king's meticulous attention to governance is evident in the surviving records of the 1318 Parliament at Scone, which addressed issues from judicial procedures to church protections. Among its statutes, a requirement that all men between 16 and 60 maintain weapons according to their wealth demonstrates Bruce's focus on military preparedness. Robert's death from leprosy in 1329 left his 5-year-old son David II on the throne under the regency of Thomas Randolph, Earl of Moray. When Randolph died in 1332, Scotland faced renewed crisis as Edward III of England supported Edward Balliol, son of John, in claiming the Scottish throne. The disinherited nobles who had lost Scottish lands for supporting England rallied to Balliol's cause. Balliol's forces achieved surprise victories at Duplin Moor, 1332, and Halidon Hill, 1333, temporarily installing him as a puppet king. The boy King David was evacuated to France for safety, where he remained until 1341. However, Scottish resistance continued under leaders like Sir Andrew Murray, son of Wallace's comrade-in-arms, and Robert the Steward, the future Robert II. The conflict's intensity diminished after 1337, when Edward III turned his attention to France and the beginning of the Hundred Years' War. By 1341, conditions had stabilized sufficiently for David II's return from exile. When the young king led an invasion of England in 1346, however, he was captured at the Battle of Neville's Cross and remained a prisoner until 1357, when a massive ransom secured his release. Edward Balliol, unable to maintain his position without English military support, formally surrendered his claim to the Scottish throne in 1356 before retiring to Yorkshire. The Wars of Independence effectively concluded with Scottish sovereignty intact, despite the enormous costs in lives and material destruction. The Wars of Independence fundamentally transformed Scotland's national identity. The struggle against English domination created powerful symbols and narratives that remained central to Scottish self-perception. John Barber's epic poem, The Bruce, c. 1375, captured this emerging national consciousness, celebrating Bruce as the embodiment of Scottish liberty and valour. The war's physical legacy included a devastated borderland, depopulated communities, and an economy strained by decades of conflict. Yet politically, Scotland emerged with strengthened institutions, a clear sense of national boundaries, and a fierce commitment to independence that would shape its relations with England for centuries. As historian Fiona Watson observes, from the cauldron of the Wars of Independence emerged a Scotland with a clearer sense of itself as a kingdom and nation than had existed before. The experience of external threat had forced Scots to articulate and defend what made them distinct. This hard-won independence would face new challenges in the centuries ahead, but the principles established during this crucible period would repeatedly resurface in Scotland's ongoing journey. The Stewart Dynasty, 1371–1567. In 1371, the crown of Scotland passed to the Stewart family through Marjorie Bruce's son, Robert, beginning a dynasty that would rule Scotland for over 3 centuries and eventually unite the Scottish and English crowns. This era witnessed Scotland's cultural flowering alongside political turbulence, as successive monarchs struggled to assert royal authority against powerful nobles while navigating the complex diplomatic waters between England and France. Robert II, 1371–1390, the first Stuart king, inherited a kingdom still recovering from the Wars of Independence and the devastating Black Death. Already 55 when crowned, Robert faced challenges from the start. Chronicler Andrew of Wintoun described him as large and fair of person, but in his later days right inattentive to the governance of his realm. His reign established a pattern that would characterize much of the Stuart era: tension between crown and nobility, with powerful regional lords often exercising greater authority than the king himself. His son John, who took the regnal name Robert III, 1390–1406, to avoid associations with the unfortunate King John Balliol, suffered physical disability after a horse-riding accident. Power largely resided with his ambitious brother, Robert, Duke of Albany, who effectively governed Scotland as the king's lieutenant. The mysterious death of the heir apparent, David, Duke of Rothesay, in 1402, while in Albany's custody, suggested the dangers of royal power struggles. Fearing for his younger son's safety, Robert III sent the 9-year-old Prince James to France for protection in 1406. Fortune turned against the plan when English ships captured the prince en route. As the dying king reportedly lamented, "I am the worst of kings and the most miserable of men. Had I died a plain knight, I had been happy. From the day I mounted the throne, my life has been one of tribulation." For 18 years, James remained an English captive, while Scotland was governed first by Albany and then by his son Murdoch. During this captivity, James received an excellent education, becoming an accomplished poet. His work, The King is Quaere, The King's Book, ranks among Scotland's finest medieval literary achievements, combining courtly love themes with philosophical reflections on fortune and governance. When finally ransomed in 1424, James I returned to Scotland determined to assert royal authority. His methods proved ruthless, arresting and executing Albany's family and other nobles who had profited during his absence. Parliament became a key instrument of his rule, with legislation strengthening royal finances and justice. The king established Scotland's first permanent court of civil justice in 1425, attempting to provide alternatives to the baronial courts dominated by noble interests. James's centralizing policies generated hostility among threatened nobles. On February 23, 1437, conspirators led by Sir Robert Graham assassinated the king at Perth's Blackfriars Monastery. As contemporary chronicler Walter Bower recounted, the first to strike him was Sir Robert Graham, who inflicted cruel wounds while saying mockingly, "This is your due, tyrant, for you were the cruel slayer of our kinsman." The brutal murder left Scotland with a 6-year-old king and another extended regency. James II, 1437–1460, inherited his father's struggle against powerful nobles. The Black Douglas family, who had accumulated vast lands and influence, posed a particular threat to royal authority. The young king's infamous solution came in 1452, when he personally stabbed William, 8th Earl of Douglas, during a dinner at Stirling Castle after the Earl refused to break a bond with other nobles. This violent episode, breaking the sacred medieval tradition of protective hospitality, demonstrated the fierce struggle for supremacy. James II's military campaigns against Douglas strongholds successfully broke the family's power, but the king's premature death in 1460, killed when a cannon exploded during the siege of Roxburgh Castle, left Scotland with another child king and regency government. James III, 1460–1488, proved less politically adept than his predecessors. His artistic interests and preference for low-born advisors alienated many traditional nobles. The king's brothers, Alexander, Duke of Albany, and John, Earl of Mar, became focal points for opposition before their mysterious demises. Albany's claims to the throne, backed intermittently by England, created particular instability. The most significant territorial expansion of medieval Scotland occurred during James III's reign through diplomacy rather than conquest. His marriage to Margaret of Denmark in 1469 brought the Northern Isles into Scottish possession, when King Christian I of Denmark pledged Orkney and Shetland as collateral for his daughter's dowry, a debt never redeemed. Growing noble discontent culminated in armed rebellion in 1488, when nobles supporting the king's teenage son confronted royal forces at Sochieburn. James III fled the battlefield only to be murdered under mysterious circumstances. The precise details remain contested, but as historian Norman MacDougall observes, few Scottish kings died in their beds, and James III's violent end would have surprised none of his contemporaries. James IV, 1488–1513, ascended the throne at age 15 under the cloud of his father's death, wearing an iron chain of penance around his waist for his indirect role in the rebellion. Despite this inauspicious beginning, his reign marked Scotland's confident emergence onto the European stage and a cultural flourishing often described as a Scottish Renaissance. The king's charismatic leadership and administrative energy transformed Scotland's governance. Unlike his father, James actively travelled throughout his kingdom, personally administering justice in remote regions and suppressing disorder. His definitive subjugation of the Lord of the Isles in 1493 brought the Western Highlands and Islands under effective crown control for the first time in centuries. James's diplomatic initiatives included the Treaty of Perpetual Peace with England in 1502, and his marriage to Margaret Tudor, daughter of Henry VII, the following year. The astute Henry reportedly noted that through this union, Scotland might one day fall to England, just as the lesser to the greater. This marriage would indeed provide the basis for the later Union of Crowns in 1603. Under James's patronage, Scotland experienced remarkable cultural and intellectual development. The University of Aberdeen, 1495, joined St Andrews, 1413, and Glasgow, 1451, as centres of learning. Parliament passed the pioneering Education Act of 1496, requiring eldest sons of barons and freeholders to attend grammar schools and study arte and jure, an early attempt at compulsory education for the elite. Renaissance humanism flourished at James's court. The king himself showed remarkable intellectual breadth, reportedly speaking 6 languages and studying subjects from dentistry to experimental surgery. Poets like William Dunbar and Gavin Douglas created sophisticated verse that rivaled continental achievements, while the introduction of printing in 1507 by Andrew Miller and Walter Chapman accelerated cultural transmission. Material culture likewise demonstrated Scotland's increasing sophistication. The magnificent Great Michael, reportedly the largest warship in Europe when launched in 1511, symbolized James's naval ambitions, while extensive renovations transformed royal palaces at Stirling, Edinburgh, and Linlithgow. The Scottish Crown's financial resources never matched England's, but James nevertheless created a court of European significance. This golden age ended catastrophically at Flodden Field in September 1513. Despite the Treaty of Perpetual Peace, the renewal of the old alliance with France drew Scotland into conflict when Henry VIII invaded France. James led a massive Scottish army into northern England, but was outmaneuvered by the Earl of Surrey's forces. The resulting battle proved the deadliest in British soil, with perhaps 10,000 Scots killed, including the king, 12 earls, 15 lords, and countless gentry. The human and political impact was devastating. As the contemporary Treux and Countre account described, in this battle were slain the King of Scots, 2 bishops, 2 mitred abbots, 12 earls, 17 lords, and knights and gentlemen, whose names and number are not yet known. The lament, Flowers of the Forest, still commemorates this national catastrophe. Once again, Scotland faced a royal minority, with the infant James V, under the nominal guardianship of his mother, Margaret Tudor. Factional struggles between pro-English and pro-French nobles dominated the Regency period, with Margaret's second marriage to the Earl of Angus further complicating the political landscape. In 1528, the 16-year-old James escaped Angus's control and began governing in his own right. Like his father, James V actively addressed Highland unrest, undertaking a spectacular voyage around Scotland in 1540 to demonstrate royal authority in remote regions. His suppression of border-reaving families showed similar determination to extend centralized control. James strengthened Scotland's French connection through successive marriages to French noblewomen. First Madeleine of Valois, who died within months of arriving in Scotland, and then Mary of Guise. These alliances reflected Scotland's continued reliance on the Old Alliance as a counterbalance to English power. Cultural patronage continued under James V, whose architectural legacy includes magnificent Renaissance additions to royal palaces and the reconstruction of Holyrood Abbey's precinct. The king's collection of musical instruments and patronage of court poets like Sir David Lindsay maintained Scotland's cultural vitality. Relations with Henry VIII deteriorated as England's break with Rome created new religious tensions. When James refused to follow his uncle into Protestantism, Henry responded with both diplomatic pressure and military threats. A disastrous Scottish defeat at Solway Moss in November 1542 proved James's undoing. He retreated to Falkland Palace, where, devastated by the military humiliation and suffering from illness, he died at just 30 years old after learning his wife had given birth to a daughter rather than the hoped-for son. The birth of Mary Stewart on December 8, 1542, placed Scotland in the perilous position of being ruled by a 6-day-old queen. Henry VIII immediately sought to control Scotland's future by demanding Mary's betrothal to his son Edward. When diplomatic approaches failed, military force followed in what became known as the Rough Wooing, a campaign of destructive border raids and invasions. The power vacuum created opportunities for religious reformers influenced by continental Protestant ideas. Early reformist figures like Patrick Hamilton and George Wishart faced persecution, but their martyrdom strengthened the reform movement. John Knox, initially Wishart's bodyguard, emerged as the dominant voice for Scottish Protestantism after his galley slavery under French captivity. Queen Mother Mary of Guise, acting as regent from 1554, relied increasingly on French troops and advisors to maintain control, fueling anti-French and pro-Protestant sentiment. The Protestant lords, styling themselves the Lords of the Congregation, signed the First Band, or Covenant in 1557, committing themselves to establishing reformed worship. The conflict escalated into armed confrontation by 1559. English intervention supporting the Protestant lords proved decisive, leading to the Treaty of Edinburgh, 1560, that removed both French and English troops from Scotland. Parliament's religious settlement that same year, passing legislation abolishing papal authority and forbidding the Mass, represented a decisive Protestant victory, despite being enacted without royal assent. Queen Mary returned to Scotland in August 1561 after 13 years in France, widowed at 18 after her brief reign as French queen consort. Her arrival presented a fundamental dilemma: a Catholic queen ruling a newly Protestant kingdom. Mary initially navigated this contradiction with political skill, allowing Protestant worship while maintaining her personal Catholicism. As she declared to Knox during their famous confrontations, "I will defend the Church of Rome, for I think it is the true Church of God." Mary's reign unraveled through a sequence of personal and political miscalculations. Her marriage to her Catholic cousin, Henry Stewart, Lord Darnley, in 1565, alienated Protestant nobles who staged the unsuccessful Chaseabout Raid rebellion. Darnley's jealousy of Mary's Italian secretary David Rizzio led to the latter's brutal murder in March 1566 at Holyrood Palace, carried out in the pregnant Queen's presence. After giving birth to the future James VI, Mary's relationship with Darnley deteriorated further. His mysterious murder in February 1567, when the house where he was staying in Edinburgh was destroyed by gunpowder, created a political crisis, particularly when Mary married James Hepburn, Earl of Bothwell, widely suspected of orchestrating Darnley's death. Noble opposition coalesced rapidly. At Carberry Hill in June 1567, Mary surrendered to Confederate lords when her forces refused to fight. Imprisoned at Lochleven Castle, she was forced to abdicate in favor of her one-year-old son. Mary's dramatic escape in 1568 led to a final military attempt to regain her throne, defeated at the Battle of Langside. Fleeing to England, she sought protection from her cousin Elizabeth Theatres, beginning 19 years of captivity that would end with her execution in 1587. Mary's tragedy embodied the religious and political tensions of 16th-century Scotland. Her personal rule lasted just 6 years, but few monarchs have inspired such enduring historical fascination. As historian Jenny Wormald observed, Mary's reign marked the end of an era in Scottish history, the culmination of medieval Scotland's independent kingdom before the transformations of Reformation, Anglicisation, and eventual political union would forever alter Scotland's path. The Protestant Reformation in Scotland, 1528 to 1580. The religious transformation of Scotland during the 16th century represented one of the most profound cultural and institutional revolutions in the nation's history. Unlike England's state-directed reform or Germany's princely Protestantism, Scotland's Reformation emerged through a complex interaction of scholarly influence, popular sentiment, and noble politics, ultimately establishing a distinctively Presbyterian religious identity that would shape Scottish culture for centuries to come. On the eve of the Reformation, Scotland's Catholic Church wielded substantial influence despite growing criticisms. With 13 dioceses, dozens of monasteries, and hundreds of parish churches, the ecclesiastical establishment controlled approximately half of Scotland's landed wealth. Archbishop James Beaton, and later his nephew Cardinal David Beaton, dominated church leadership, using their positions to accumulate personal power and wealth. Complaints about clerical abuses, similar to those that sparked reform elsewhere in Europe, circulated widely. The Provincial Council of 1549 acknowledged that the corruption of morals and profane lewdness of life in churchmen of almost all ranks had undermined the Church's credibility. Parish priests often lacked adequate education, while pluralism, holding multiple benefices, meant many clergy neglected their pastoral duties. Nevertheless, evidence suggests vibrant lay religious participation before the Reformation. Testamentary bequests funded thousands of chaplainries and altars, while confraternities, religious guilds, sponsored charitable works throughout urban Scotland. Popular devotional practices centered on saints' cults and pilgrimage sites like St Andrews and Whithorn. As historian Audrey Beth Fitch demonstrated, pre-Reformation spirituality emphasized the integration of the sacred into everyday life through ritual objects, gestures, words, and actions. Humanist scholarship provided intellectual foundations for religious questioning. By the 1520s, Lutheran ideas were entering Scotland through ports like Leith and Dundee, where merchants maintained close connections with continental Europe. Officials repeatedly banned heretical books, suggesting their circulation was sufficiently widespread to cause concern. The University of St Andrews became an early centre for reformed thinking, despite being Scotland's ecclesiastical capital. Patrick Hamilton, a young scholar influenced by both humanist learning and Lutheran theology during studies in Paris and Marburg, returned to St Andrews and began teaching reformed ideas. His execution for heresy in 1528, burned at the stake in a 6-hour ordeal, created Scotland's first Protestant martyr. As theologian John Fox noted in his Martyrology, the reek smoke of Master Patrick Hamilton infected as many as it blew upon. A grim acknowledgement that Hamilton's execution inspired rather than deterred Reform sympathizers. Over the following decades, several dozen Scots faced persecution for Protestant beliefs, though executions remained relatively rare compared to continental Europe. Reform sentiments intensified in the 1540s during Cardinal Beaton's aggressive campaign against heresy. George Wishart, who had studied in Switzerland and been influenced by Zwinglian ideas, returned to Scotland in 1543 and began preaching throughout Angus, Lothian, and the Borders. His charismatic evangelism attracted growing audiences, including a young John Knox, who reportedly carried a two-handed sword to protect him. Wishart's arrest and execution in 1546, burned at the stake in St Andrews under Cardinal Beaton's direction, galvanized Protestant sympathizers. Within 3 months, a group of Protestant lairds, joined by others with grievances against Beaton, entered St Andrews Castle and murdered the cardinal, gruesomely displaying his body from the castle window. As Knox later recorded with evident approval, "These are the works of our God," whereby he would admonish the tyrants of this earth that their cruel murders and oppression shall not escape his vengeance. The Castilians, as the assassins and their supporters became known, held St Andrews Castle for over a year, creating a Protestant enclave where Knox emerged as their preacher. When French naval forces eventually recaptured the castle in July 1547, Knox and others were condemned to serve as galley slaves, an experience that intensified Knox's hostility toward both Catholicism and France. Knox's formative period in exile proved crucial for Scottish Protestantism's development. After obtaining release from the galleys in 1549, he spent time in England under Edward VI before fleeing to Geneva during Mary Tudor's Catholic Restoration. There, Knox studied directly under John Calvin, absorbing Calvinist theology and Reformed church governance principles. Geneva's model of a disciplined, well-ordered Protestant community profoundly influenced Knox's vision for Scotland. His first blast of the trumpet against the monstrous regiment of women, 1558, a polemic against female rulers, reflected not only misogyny but also his opposition to the Catholic queens Mary Tudor and Mary of Guise. Ironically, this work complicated his relations with Protestant Elizabeth I after her accession. Knox returned to Scotland in 1559 at a critical juncture. His fiery preaching in Perth on May 11th triggered Scotland's decisive break with Catholic worship when the congregation, inflamed by his sermon against idolatry, systematically dismantled the town's religious houses. As Knox recounted, the multitude were so inflamed that neither could the exhortation of the preacher nor the commandment of the magistrate stay them from destroying the places of idolatry. This pattern of reform, incendiary preaching, followed by orderly iconoclasm, spread through central Scotland. Unlike continental iconoclasm, Scotland's image-breaking generally occurred without significant bloodshed, focusing on dismantling the apparatus of Catholic worship rather than attacking individuals. Scotland's Reformation gained decisive momentum through noble support. In 1557, a group of Protestant sympathizing nobles signed the First Band, or Covenant, committing themselves to establishing the most blessed word of God and his congregation. These lords of the congregation provided crucial military and political backing for religious reform. The death of Mary of Guise in June 1560 removed a key obstacle to reform, creating opportunity for revolution. The Treaty of Edinburgh secured the withdrawal of both French and English forces from Scotland, allowing Scots to determine their own religious settlement without direct external interference. The Reformation Parliament of August 1560 enacted three key measures: abolishing papal authority in Scotland, banning the Mass, and adopting the Protestant Confession of Faith. Significantly, these acts proceeded without royal assent, as Queen Mary remained in France. Knox and 5 colleagues drafted a new church constitution, the First Book of Discipline, proposing comprehensive reforms to church governance, worship, education, and poor relief. As historian Jenny Wormald observed, the Scottish Reformation was a revolution which succeeded because of a rare conjunction of religious enthusiasm, political opportunity, and foreign policy considerations, allowing a determined minority to impose their vision on a religiously unconvinced or uncommitted majority. Scottish Protestantism's theological framework reflected its Calvinist origins. The Scots Confession emphasized core Reformed doctrines: salvation through faith alone, the supreme authority of Scripture, predestination, and the spiritual rather than physical presence of Christ in communion. This confession remained the Kirk's doctrinal standard until replaced by the Westminster Confession in 1647. Unlike the hierarchical episcopal structure maintained in England, Scotland developed a Presbyterian system centered on 4 interlocking courts: Kirk sessions, parish level, presbyteries, district level, synods, regional level, and the General Assembly, national level. This system limited clerical authority through lay elder participation while maintaining national religious unity. The Book of Common Order, 1564, largely adapted from the liturgy of the English congregation in Geneva, provided guidance for worship services characterized by simplicity. Elaborate Catholic ceremonies gave way to services centered on Scripture: reading, prayer, psalm singing, and, most significantly, preaching. As historian Margot Todd noted, the sermon became the central event of communal religious experience. The Reformation's social vision extended far beyond theology. Knox's First Book of Discipline outlined an ambitious educational program, proposing a school in every parish, expanded secondary education in towns, and university reform. Though fully implemented only gradually over subsequent generations, this emphasis on universal male literacy laid foundations for Scotland's educational tradition. Kirk sessions, comprising the minister and lay elders, assumed responsibility for communal moral discipline. Their records reveal meticulous attention to behaviors from sexual immorality and drunkenness to Sabbath breaking and interpersonal disputes. Punishments typically involved public repentance rather than physical penalties, emphasizing reconciliation with the community. Women's experiences under the Reformation presented contrasts. The abolition of female religious orders eliminated traditional spiritual vocations for women, while Reformed emphasis on patriarchal household structure could reinforce gender hierarchies. Yet Protestant emphasis on spiritual equality, Bible reading, and companionate marriage offered new forms of religious participation and authority. As the passage notes, female religious experience found expression through prayer societies, spiritual conversations, and close pastoral relationships. Recent scholarship has highlighted how godly women exercised significant informal influence within Reformed communities. The conversion narrative of Mistress Rutherford, for instance, circulated as an exemplary account of feminine piety, while Lady Culross's religious poetry demonstrated women's theological engagement. Scotland's Reformation followed distinct geographical patterns. The Eastern Lowlands, with their trade connections to Protestant Northern Europe and higher concentration of burghs, generally embraced reform more readily than Western regions. By contrast, the Highlands and Islands, with stronger Gaelic traditions and weaker institutional structures, presented greater challenges to Protestant penetration. Many Catholic priests simply adapted to the new religious regime, adopting Protestant forms while maintaining their positions. As a result, genuine theological transformation often lagged behind institutional changes. John Rowe, minister of Perth, complained in 1574 that many parishes still contained readers who have neither gift of utterance or knowledge of the Scriptures. Cultural change proved more gradual than institutional reform, with religious practices transforming unevenly. In some Highland areas, Catholic practices persisted openly for generations, while elsewhere folk customs incorporated elements of both traditions. Archaeological evidence reveals how Catholic sacramental objects were sometimes hidden rather than destroyed, preserving older traditions alongside new practices. By the 1570s, Protestantism had become Scotland's official religion, but the Reformation remained incomplete in important respects. When Andrew Melville returned from Geneva in 1574, bringing an intensified vision of Presbyterianism, he found a church still operating with quasi-episcopal structures under superintendence. His efforts to establish full Presbyterian governance faced resistance from the crown and some nobles, who preferred maintaining elements of episcopal authority subject to royal influence. Financial constraints seriously limited reform implementation. Most of the First Book of Discipline's ambitious social program remained unfunded as nobles who had supported the Reformation nevertheless retained former church lands and revenues for themselves. Ministers frequently complained of inadequate stipends, while parish schools developed slowly due to resource limitations. Religious uniformity proved elusive. Despite official Protestant establishment, Catholic recusancy persisted, particularly among some noble families and in Highland areas. Meanwhile, tensions between moderate and radical Protestants emerged, especially regarding church governance and the relationship between church and state. By 1580, Scotland had transformed from a Catholic kingdom into a Protestant nation with a distinctively reformed identity. This revolution occurred without the significant religious wars that devastated parts of continental Europe, though not without conflict and coercion. The particular form of Presbyterianism that emerged, emphasizing educated clergy, participatory governance, and moral discipline, would profoundly shape Scottish culture and national identity. As historian Jane Dawson concludes, the Scottish Reformation created a church built from the middle outwards, neither entirely imposed from above nor entirely driven from below. This distinctive pattern produced a church with strong local roots yet national coherence, capable of both challenging and supporting secular authority. This creative tension would define Scottish religious life for centuries to come. The Reformation's influence extended far beyond religion narrowly defined. Its emphasis on education, literacy, and moral discipline fostered a distinctive Scottish intellectual tradition. The participatory elements of Presbyterian governance provided models for political representation, while the notion of covenant between God and community provided a powerful conceptual framework for understanding social and political relationships. Perhaps most significantly, the Reformed Kirk became a key institution defining Scottishness itself, distinct from both English Anglicanism and continental Catholicism. When later conflicts arose with England, religious distinctiveness would reinforce Scotland's separate identity, even as political union drew the nations closer. The Reformation thus represents not merely a theological shift, but a fundamental reconfiguration of Scottish culture and identity whose consequences continue to resonate. Scotland in the 17th century, Revolution, Civil War, and economic crisis, 1603 to 1700. The 17th century marked a transformative period in Scottish history, beginning with the momentous Union of the Crowns and concluding with economic disaster that would set the stage for the Parliamentary Union of 1707. Throughout these tumultuous decades, Scotland experienced religious strife, civil war, foreign occupation, and failed colonial ambitions, challenges that fundamentally reshaped its political landscape and national identity. Queen Elizabeth I's death without direct heirs in 1603 fulfilled the dynastic ambition that had eluded Scottish monarchs for centuries. James VI of Scotland, great-grandson of Henry VII through his mother Mary, Queen of Scots, inherited the English throne as James I, creating the personal union of crowns that would last for over a century. James departed Edinburgh for London with remarkable haste, promising to return every 3 years, yet visiting his northern kingdom only once in 1617. Despite physically relocating, James maintained that the union was purely dynastic. The kingdoms retained separate parliaments, legal systems, and churches. Nevertheless, the king's vision extended further, proclaiming himself King of Great Britain and adopting an imperial rhetoric that alarmed parliaments in both nations. For Scotland, the immediate consequences of royal absenteeism were profound. Government administration continued through the Privy Council, controlled by aristocratic factions competing for royal favour, now dispensed from distant London. Scotland became, as historian Keith Brown observed, a semi-autonomous satellite kingdom, ruled by correspondence and periodic visits from court favourites. James pursued several strategies to extend royal authority across his realms. In the troublesome Western Highlands and Islands, he leveraged English naval power to enforce the Statutes of Iona, 1609, compelling clan chiefs to send their heirs to be educated in lowland schools, restricting traditional bards and limiting weapons and alcohol. These measures accelerated the cultural integration of Highland elites into lowland society, though their implementation remained inconsistent. The plantation of Ulster represented another significant consequence of the regal union. With English resources now available, James encouraged Scottish settlement in Northern Ireland to establish a Protestant presence in the predominantly Catholic region. By the 1630s, approximately 50,000 Scots had relocated to Ulster, creating enduring cultural and religious connections that would later influence migration patterns to North America. James's religious policy revealed the inherent tensions in governing his two kingdoms. Raised in Presbyterian Scotland, he nevertheless embraced the hierarchical Anglican model, famously declaring, "No bishop, no king." While maintaining Scotland's Presbyterian worship forms, he gradually reintroduced bishops to oversee church governance, creating a hybrid system that satisfied neither ardent Presbyterians nor full Episcopalians. His son Charles I, lacking James's political pragmatism and Scottish upbringing, pushed religious uniformity more aggressively. In 1637, Charles attempted to impose a new prayer book on the Scottish Church without proper consultation. This liturgy, perceived as excessively Anglican and potentially papist, provoked immediate resistance. When Dean Hannay attempted to read from the new prayer book in St Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, market woman Jenny Geddes reportedly hurled her stool at him, triggering widespread riots. Opposition quickly organised around the National Covenant of 1638, signed initially at Greyfriars Kirk in Edinburgh, before copies circulated nationwide. This document, combining religious conviction with constitutional concerns, pledged to defend Scotland's reformed religion against innovations while maintaining allegiance to the Crown. As historian David Stevenson notes, the Covenant linked religious passion with patriotic sentiment and constitutional principle in a potent mix that mobilised Scottish society to an unprecedented degree. The General Assembly that convened in Glasgow in November 1638 dismantled James's ecclesiastical settlement, abolishing bishops and declaring episcopacy contrary to Scripture. Charles interpreted these actions as rebellion and raised an army to suppress the Covenanters. The resulting conflict, known as the Bishops' Wars, 1639–1640, proved disastrous for the king. At the first encounter near Berwick, negotiations prevented bloodshed, but when fighting resumed in 1640, Scottish forces defeated the king's northern army at Newburn and occupied Newcastle. Lacking funds to continue the conflict, Charles summoned the English Parliament, inactive for 11 years, precipitating the constitutional crisis that would lead to civil war. As contemporary observer Robert Bailey recognised, none in England did more for our cause than the king's own hands. His obstinacy made all men desperate. What began as a Scottish religious dispute escalated into interconnected conflicts across Charles's three kingdoms. By 1642, England had descended into civil war between parliamentarians and royalists. Scottish Covenanters, fearing that a royal victory would endanger their religious settlement, allied with English parliamentarians through the Solemn League and Covenant, 1643. This agreement promised Scottish military assistance in exchange for religious reform in England along Presbyterian lines. A Scottish army under the Earl of Leven crossed into England in January 1644, playing a decisive role at the Battle of Marston Moor that July, which secured northern England for Parliament. Yet this intervention proved controversial among Scots, who questioned whether armed alliance with English sectarians truly served their religious interests. Royalist sentiment in Scotland found expression through James Graham, Marquis of Montrose, who launched a brilliant Highland campaign between 1644 and 1645. Supported by Irish troops under Alasdair MacColla and employing innovative tactics suited to Highland warriors, Montrose won a series of remarkable victories against larger Covenanter forces at Tippermuir, Aberdeen, Inverlochy, Aldern, Alford and Kilsyth. Contemporary chronicler Patrick Gordon of Ruthven marvelled at how Montrose, with a handful of naked, untrained Highlanders, defeated well-provided and disciplined armies. Yet without broader lowland support, Montrose couldn't translate military success into political control. His forces were eventually routed at Philiphaugh in September 1645, ending the Royalist challenge in Scotland. The Covenanter alliance with Parliament fractured after the king's defeat. When the English army radicalised and religious independence gained influence over Presbyterians, the Scots negotiated separately with the captive Charles. In the engagement of December 1647, Charles promised to establish Presbyterianism in England for a 3-year trial period in exchange for Scottish military support. This agreement split the Covenanter movement between engagers and radical Kirk Party opponents. The resulting Scottish invasion of England in 1648, led by the Duke of Hamilton, ended in defeat at Preston. The English army's subsequent execution of Charles I in January 1649, without Scottish consent, horrified even his Scottish opponents. The Scottish Parliament immediately proclaimed his son as Charles II, setting Scotland on collision course with the new English Commonwealth. The proclamation of Charles II as king prompted Oliver Cromwell to invade Scotland in 1650. Despite the Scots raising a substantial army under David Leslie, Cromwell secured a decisive victory at Dunbar in September 1650, where he famously observed the Scots' disadvantageous position and declared, "The Lord hath delivered them into our hands." Charles II was nevertheless crowned at Scone on January 1, 1651, before leading a desperate invasion of England that ended in defeat at Worcester in September. Scotland subsequently faced complete military occupation under General George Monk, with English garrisons positioned throughout the country. The Scottish Parliament and Committee of Estates were dissolved, replaced by English commissioners governing from Dalkeith Palace near Edinburgh. In 1654, Scotland was formally incorporated into Cromwell's Commonwealth and Free State through the Tender of Union, not as an equal partner, but as a subordinate territory. While Scottish representatives attended the Commonwealth Parliaments in London, they were always outnumbered and rarely influential. As historian Patrick Little notes, this was incorporation without representation on any meaningful scale. The occupation brought certain benefits: religious tolerance beyond what the Presbyterian establishment had permitted, legal reforms that improved efficiency, free trade within the Commonwealth, and unprecedented security in the Highlands. The English commander in Scotland, General Monk, proved a relatively moderate administrator who gradually incorporated Scottish elites into the governance structure. Yet military occupation imposed heavy costs. Taxation to support army garrisons was approximately $90,000 monthly, an unprecedented burden on a much smaller economy than England's. Cromwell's Navigation Acts also restricted Scottish trading rights, excluding Scots from colonial commerce. Popular resistance remained limited after the Battle of Loch Garry, 1654, though Royalist sentiment persisted, particularly in the Highlands. The Cromwellian regime collapsed following Oliver's death in 1658. General Monk, commanding forces in Scotland, ultimately supported the restoration of Charles II, marching south to facilitate the king's return in 1660. The restoration brought Scotland's re-establishment as an independent kingdom with its own parliament, legal system and church, though one firmly under royal control through the king's commissioners. Charles II's religious settlement disappointed Presbyterian expectations. The Rescissory Act of 1661 swept away all legislation enacted since 1633, effectively annulling the Covenanting Revolution. Episcopacy returned, with bishops reinstated to govern the church. Around 270 ministers, approximately one-third of Scotland's clergy, were ejected from their parishes for refusing to accept episcopal authority. The ejected ministers and their followers began holding outdoor conventicles, illegal religious assemblies on hillsides and in remote locations, particularly in the southwestern counties of Ayrshire, Lanarkshire and Galloway. Government persecution of these religious dissenters intensified throughout the 1660s and 1670s, with fines, imprisonment and military harassment becoming common. As historian Claire Jackson observes, what began as a dispute over church government evolved into a struggle over fundamental liberties and the limits of obedience to secular authority. The government's attempts to suppress conventicles sparked violent resistance. After a failed uprising in 1666, known as the Pentland Rising, tensions escalated again in 1679, when a group of Covenanters assassinated Archbishop James Sharp, whom they viewed as a traitor to Presbyterianism. The subsequent rebellion was crushed at Bothwell Bridge by forces under the king's illegitimate son, the Duke of Monmouth. The early 1680s witnessed intensified persecution during what became known as the Killing Time. Under royal commanders like John Graham of Claverhouse, Bluidy Clavers to his opponents, government forces administered summary justice. An estimated 100 Covenanters were executed during this period, while others faced transportation to the American colonies. Popular memory preserved these events through martyrologies like Naphtali and A Cloud of Witnesses, which celebrated the steadfastness of those who died rather than compromise their religious principles. When Charles II died in February 1685, his brother James VII, Second of England, succeeded despite being openly Catholic. Initial resistance was limited, as James promised to respect the Protestant establishment. However, his policies soon alienated Scottish elites, dismissing Parliament, governing through an obedient Privy Council, pursuing toleration for Catholics, and purging Presbyterians from universities and local government. The birth of a male heir in June 1688 created the prospect of a Catholic succession, precipitating the crisis that led Protestant nobles to invite William of Orange to intervene. When William landed in England in November 1688, Scottish support for James rapidly collapsed. Edinburgh students burned an effigy of the Pope, while Presbyterian crowds attacked Catholic properties and episcopal clergy throughout the lowlands. The Convention of Estates that assembled in Edinburgh in March 1689 took a more radical approach than the English Parliament. Rather than accepting the fiction that James had abdicated, the Scots explicitly declared that he had forfeited the crown through his actions. The resulting claim of right denounced specific royal abuses and established explicit limitations on royal power before offering the crown to William and Mary. Religious settlement proved contentious. William personally favoured religious toleration but recognised Presbyterian strength in Scotland. Parliament finally abolished episcopacy in 1689 and re-established Presbyterianism in 1690, though without restoring the covenants or imposing the strict uniformity advocated by hardliners. This revolution settlement excluded Episcopalian clergy, while also restraining Presbyterian extremism. As historian Karen Cullen notes, the revolution in Scotland was ultimately more transformative than in England, fundamentally reconfiguring the relationship between Crown, Parliament and Kirk, while establishing more explicit constitutional safeguards against absolutism. Not all Scots accepted the revolution settlement. John Graham of Claverhouse, now Viscount Dundee, Bonnie Dundee to Jacobite supporters, raised the standard for James in the Highlands. His forces, primarily Highland clansmen opposed to Campbell power and loyal to the traditional monarchy, secured a victory at Killiecrankie in July 1689. Yet Dundee died in the battle, and without his leadership, the Jacobite forces disintegrated after defeat at Dunkeld. The government moved to secure Highland allegiance, requiring clan chiefs to swear allegiance to William and Mary before January 1, 1692. The MacDonalds of Glencoe, delayed by weather and bureaucratic confusion, submitted shortly after the deadline. Government forces under Campbell command subsequently carried out a notorious massacre on February 13, 1692, killing 38 MacDonalds in violation of Highland hospitality traditions. Though relatively small in scale, the Glencoe massacre acquired powerful symbolic significance. As contemporary pamphleteer Charles Leslie wrote, the incident demonstrated to Highlanders that no oath or paper submission could save them from the determined slaughter. Government complicity, with instructions signed by the king himself, damaged the new regime's moral authority and reinforced Highland suspicions of lowland government. The 1690s brought severe economic challenges to Scotland. Adverse weather conditions produced harvest failures in 1695, 1696, and 1698-1699, a period known as the Seven Ill Years. Contemporary estimates suggest that in some northern parishes, up to 20% of the population died from resulting famine. Population loss through death and emigration exceeded 15% in the worst affected regions. This agricultural crisis coincided with trade disruptions caused by England's wars with France. The Navigation Acts continued to exclude Scots from colonial trade, while French protectionism closed traditional markets for Scottish goods. The newly established Bank of Scotland, 1695, helped modernise financial systems, but could not overcome these structural problems. Against this backdrop, the ambitious Darien scheme emerged as a potential solution to Scotland's economic marginalisation. The Company of Scotland Trading to Africa and the Indies, chartered in 1695, aimed to establish a Scottish colony at Darien, in modern Panama, that would control a crucial trade route between Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. This venture attracted unprecedented investment, approximately $400,000, representing perhaps 20 to 25% of Scotland's available capital. The Darien scheme demonstrated remarkable national unity, attracting investment across social classes. As contemporary observer George Ridpath reported, the frenzy of the Scots to take in stock was so great that in 9 days, £800,000 was subscribed for, resolving to have no partners in any other nation. When English investors withdrew under political pressure, the company raised capital exclusively within Scotland, making the venture's success a matter of national pride. Between 1698 and 1700, 3 expeditions with approximately 3,000 settlers departed for Darien. The outcome proved catastrophic. Inadequate planning, tropical diseases, Spanish hostility, and English colonial authorities' refusal to provide assistance doomed the colony. Fewer than 1,000 settlers survived, and only 1 ship returned to Scotland. The financial losses were devastating. Approximately 25–50% of Scotland's liquid capital vanished. Beyond financial impact, the Darien disaster had profound psychological and political consequences. Many Scots blamed English obstruction for the colony's failure, exacerbating Anglo-Scottish tensions. As contemporary pamphleteer Andrew Fletcher lamented, "We are the only people in the world that may not have the common privilege to trade, not because we have not commodities to trade with, nor ports to trade from, but because we are Scots." This economic catastrophe, combined with the famine conditions of the 1690s, created a crisis that would ultimately lead many Scottish elites to reconsider the nature of Anglo-Scottish relations. The personal union of crowns had delivered neither prosperity nor security, setting the stage for debates about fuller constitutional integration that would dominate Scotland's political landscape in the early 18th century. Scotland in the 18th century, Union, Enlightenment and Transformation, 1700 to 1800. The 18th century witnessed Scotland's remarkable metamorphosis from an impoverished, politically subordinate nation into a dynamic centre of intellectual and economic innovation. Following the contentious union with England, Scotland experienced a complex transition marked by Jacobite resistance, intellectual flowering, religious fragmentation, and the beginning of industrial development, all while the ancient Highland social system faced unprecedented pressures that would ultimately lead to its collapse. Scotland entered the 18th century in crisis. The disastrous Darien scheme had depleted national capital, while successive harvest failures in the 1690s created widespread famine. England's restrictive Navigation Acts prevented Scottish access to colonial markets, and English political pressure constrained Scotland's foreign policy options. These factors created the context for the contentious negotiations leading to the 1707 Union. The treaty ultimately passed the Scottish Parliament by 110 votes to 69, following what contemporary observer George Lockhart of Carnwaith called a most strange, unaccountable proceeding, characterized by English bribes, political pressure, and economic coercion. Later investigations identified approximately $20,000 disbursed to key Scottish politicians, ostensibly as arrears of salary, but widely interpreted as bribes. As historian Christopher Whatley argues, the negotiations themselves combined high principle with base corruption. The Union abolished the Scottish Parliament, with Scotland receiving just 45 representatives in the 513-member House of Commons and 16 Scottish peers in the House of Lords. It established a customs and monetary union, standardised weights and measures, and guaranteed Presbyterian church governance. Scotland's legal system, with its Roman law foundations, remained distinct from England's common law tradition. Contemporary reactions to the Union ranged from pragmatic acceptance to outright hostility. "We are bought and sold for English gold," lamented poet Robert Burns in a later reflection of popular sentiment. Riots erupted in Edinburgh, Glasgow, and Dumfries, while Presbyterian clergy feared for the future independence of their kirk, despite nominal protections in the treaty. Yet the Union's long-term economic benefits gradually materialized. As economist Adam Smith observed in 1776, by the union with England, the middling and inferior ranks of people in Scotland gained a complete deliverance from the power of an aristocracy which had always before oppressed them. Access to colonial markets and English commercial networks opened unprecedented opportunities for merchants, particularly in Glasgow, where trade with the American colonies in tobacco and sugar generated substantial wealth. Transformation came neither immediately nor without pain. As historian T.M. Devine notes, it took nearly 50 years before the economic benefits that were central to the pro-union case began to be realized on a significant scale. The early decades after the Union witnessed continued poverty, currency adjustment difficulties, and growing fears of Anglican influence over Scottish religious life, conditions that fueled Jacobite sentiment and Highland resistance. Jacobitism, support for the restoration of the exiled Stewart Dynasty, represented the most significant challenge to the post-Union settlement. The movement combined multiple strands: Highland clan loyalties, Episcopalian and Catholic religious sentiments, Scottish nationalist resentment of the Union, and genuine belief in divine right monarchy. The first serious rising came in 1708 when the Old Pretender, James Francis Edward Stewart, son of James VII, attempted a French-backed invasion. Though thwarted by the Royal Navy, this effort revealed the fragility of the new constitutional arrangement. A more substantial rising occurred in 1715, when the Earl of Mar raised the Stuart standard shortly after the Hanoverian succession of George VI. This 15 rebellion exhibited the fractured nature of Scottish society. While Highland clans and northeastern Episcopalian gentry rallied to the Jacobite cause, the Presbyterian lowlands largely remained loyal to the Hanoverian government. Despite early successes, including the capture of Perth, the rebellion faltered after the indecisive Battle of Sheriffmuir and collapsed when James belatedly arrived in Scotland, only to advise retreat. A further attempt in 1719, with Spanish support, ended in defeat at Glen Shiel. The final and most famous Jacobite challenge came in 1745, when Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, landed in the Hebrides with minimal French support. His charismatic leadership and early military successes, including the capture of Edinburgh and victory at Prestonpans, briefly threatened the Hanoverian regime. The Jacobite army marched as far south as Derby, before strategic indecision forced a retreat to Scotland. The government's response proved decisive. At Culloden Moor on April 16, 1746, the Duke of Cumberland's forces shattered the Highland army in a battle that quickly degenerated into massacre. As eyewitness accounts attest, wounded Jacobites were systematically executed, and civilian sympathizers faced reprisals. "The moor was covered with blood," wrote James Johnstone, a Jacobite officer, "and our unfortunate countrymen experienced every kind of cruelty that barbarous and sanguinary people could devise." The aftermath brought unprecedented government intervention in Highland society. The Disarming Act prohibited weapons possession, while the Dress Act banned Highland clothing, tartan, kilt, and plaid, for all but military regiments. The Heritable Jurisdictions Act abolished traditional clan justice systems, transferring legal authority to government courts. Collectively, these measures aimed to destroy the cultural and legal foundations of clan society. The defeat of Jacobitism accelerated Scotland's integration into British political structures. though in ways that preserved distinctive Scottish institutions. Political management fell to influential aristocrats like Archibald Campbell, 3rd Duke of Argyll, who effectively served as Scotland's political manager from the 1720s until 1761. Known as the Viceroy of Scotland, Argyll controlled government appointments and patronage through his Whig network. Scotland's political representation in London remained numerically minimal, but gained disproportionate influence through patronage networks and ministerial appointments. Henry Dundas, later Viscount Melville, dominated Scottish politics from the 1780s to 1806, earning the nickname Harry IX for his near-monarchical control of Scottish appointments. Through his alliance with Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger, Dundas helped secure lucrative colonial and administrative positions for Scottish allies. The Dundas system exemplified what historian Michael Fry calls the politics of improvement, using patronage to advance Scottish economic interests while maintaining social stability. Critics noted the deeply conservative nature of this arrangement, as Dundas steadfastly opposed parliamentary reform and religious toleration. Nevertheless, the system channeled Scottish ambitions into British imperial ventures rather than separatist politics. Scottish recruitment into British military and imperial service reached extraordinary levels. By the 1780s, Scots comprised approximately half the East India Company's medical staff and a disproportionate percentage of colonial administrators. Scottish regiments became legendary within the British Army, with Highland units serving as elite shock troops. As historian Linda Colley observed, a people who were, in numerical terms, a peripheral component of the British state thus secured an impressive centrality within the empire. The traditional clan system underwent fundamental transformation during the 18th century through processes that began before Culloden, but accelerated dramatically afterward. Clan chiefs increasingly abandoned their traditional roles as patriarchal protectors of their people in favor of becoming commercial landlords focused on maximizing estate revenues. This transformation occurred through several interconnected developments. Growing consumer culture among Highland elites created pressure for monetary income rather than traditional payments in kind. Legal changes after Culloden undermined traditional guarantees of land tenure. Most significantly, many clan chiefs accumulated unsustainable debts to finance their participation in Lowland and London society. The result was the first phase of what became known as the Highland Clearances, the systematic replacement of traditional communal townships with more profitable sheep farms. As early as the 1760s, estates in Argyll began evicting tenants to create larger farm units. By the 1770s and 1780s, the process had spread across the Highlands, with former tenants resettled in coastal crofting communities where they were expected to combine subsistence farming with commercial fishing or kelp harvesting. Contemporary accounts reveal the human trauma of these displacements. Minister Donald Sage described one clearance in Sutherland. The consternation and confusion were extreme. Little time was given for removal, the people striving to remove the sick and the helpless before the fire should reach them. Suffering themselves the extremities of hunger, many never-to-be-forgotten scenes of terror and devastation were enacted. Agricultural improvement transformed the landscape itself. The traditional run-rig system of communal farming gave way to enclosed fields and consolidated tenancies. Between 1760 and 1815, agricultural output in Scotland doubled, reflecting new crop rotations, better implements, and selective breeding. These changes brought greater efficiency, but often at considerable social cost. Regional diversity characterized Highland adaptation. While areas like Argyll and Easter Ross saw earlier commercial transformation, more remote areas maintained traditional structures longer. The Isle of Skye retained run-rig agriculture into the early 19th century, while parts of the Outer Hebrides preserved communal farming until even later. This uneven development created complex patterns of cultural and economic change. Against this backdrop of social transformation, Scotland produced an extraordinary flowering of intellectual achievement known as the Scottish Enlightenment. This movement, centred in Edinburgh but extending to Glasgow, Aberdeen and beyond, established Scotland as a leading centre of philosophy, economics, medicine, geology, and other disciplines. The institutional foundations of this achievement included Scotland's distinctive university system. Unlike Oxford and Cambridge, Scottish universities emphasised practical subjects alongside classical learning. The introduction of professorships in subjects like medicine, Edinburgh 1726, chemistry, Glasgow 1747, and natural history, Edinburgh 1767, created an infrastructure for scientific advancement. Lower tuition costs and absence of religious tests made Scottish universities more accessible than their English counterparts. Beyond universities, Scotland developed a remarkable civil society infrastructure, including literary and philosophical societies, subscription libraries, and periodicals. The Select Society, founded in Edinburgh in 1754, brought together nobles, professors, lawyers, and clergy for weekly debates. The Philosophical Society of Edinburgh, 1737, provided a forum for scientific discussion. Unlike much of continental Europe, Scotland's intellectual life extended beyond aristocratic circles to include the middling sorts of provincial towns. The philosophical achievements of the Scottish Enlightenment centred on what contemporaries called the science of man, systematic investigation of human nature, society, and history. Francis Hutcheson, 1694–1746, holding the chair of moral philosophy at Glasgow, pioneered this approach by arguing for innate moral faculties that could be studied empirically. His utilitarian principle, the greatest happiness for the greatest number, anticipated later ethical theories and political reforms. David Hume, 1711–1776, emerged as the Enlightenment's most radical thinker. His treatise of human nature, 1739–40, and subsequent works challenged established assumptions about reason, religion, and knowledge itself. Hume's skepticism about causation, his critique of miracles, and his naturalistic explanation of religion made him controversial in his lifetime, but immensely influential in subsequent philosophy. Adam Smith, 1723–1790, achieved international recognition with The Wealth of Nations, 1776, which analyzed market dynamics and articulated principles of economic liberty that would shape subsequent capitalism. Often overlooked is Smith's earlier theory of moral sentiments, 1759, which explored how sympathy and fellow feeling create moral communities. Together, these works offered a complex vision of human motivation beyond simple self-interest. The historical works of William Robertson, Adam Ferguson, and John Miller pioneered sociological understanding of human development. By comparing savage, barbarous, and civilized societies, these thinkers developed models of social evolution that explained how institutions, property relations, and cultural practices transformed across time. This comparative approach would influence 19th-century anthropology and sociology. The Scottish Enlightenment's practical impact extended to medicine, geology, engineering, and agriculture. Joseph Black's discovery of latent heat advanced both theoretical chemistry and practical applications in the emerging steam technology. James Hutton's theory of the Earth, 1795, established foundational principles of modern geology, including deep time and uniformitarianism. James Anderson pioneered agricultural improvements, while James Watt's innovations in steam power helped drive industrialization. Scotland's transformation from an agricultural to an industrial economy began in the 18th century, though would only reach full momentum after 1800. The foundations for this change included agricultural improvement, proto-industrial developments in textiles, emerging banking institutions, technological innovation, and access to colonial markets. Linen production dominated early Scottish manufacturing, expanding dramatically after the 1740s under the guidance of the Board of Trustees for Manufactures. By the 1760s, Scotland produced approximately 12 million yards of linen annually, employing thousands in spinning, weaving, and finishing processes. Unlike later factory production, linen manufacturing operated primarily through domestic putting-out systems, with merchants coordinating rural outworkers. Glasgow emerged as Scotland's leading commercial centre, its wealth built initially on the tobacco trade. By the 1770s, Glasgow merchants controlled over half of Britain's tobacco imports, creating substantial capital accumulation. When the American Revolution disrupted this trade, merchants diversified into sugar, cotton and industrial investments. Alexander Houston and Cummin, for instance, transitioned from tobacco importing to establishing one of Scotland's first cotton mills at Anderston in 1780. The early textile factories represented Scotland's first modern industrial enterprises. New Lanark, established by David Dale in 1786, employed over 1,500 workers by 1800, using water power from the Falls of Clyde to drive cotton spinning machinery. Though primarily using English technologies, Scottish manufacturers innovated in areas like fine muslin production and chemical bleaching. Banking innovation provided essential financial infrastructure. Unlike England, where banking remained restricted, Scotland developed a dynamic, competitive banking system. The Bank of Scotland, 1695, Royal Bank of Scotland, 1727, and British Linen Company, 1746, established branch networks that channeled capital into emerging industries. By 1800, Scotland had approximately 400 bank branches, one office per 7,000 people, double England's ratio, supporting industrial and commercial expansion. Coal mining expanded to meet industrial and urban fuel demands, with output rising from approximately 700,000 tons annually in the 1770s to over 2 million tons by 1800. The Carron Iron Works, established near Falkirk in 1759, pioneered industrial metallurgy, producing cannons, steam engine components, and consumer goods. Though less developed than England's iron industry, these foundations would support 19th-century heavy industrial growth. The 18th century witnessed significant religious fragmentation as the established Church of Scotland experienced several secessions. These divisions reflected both theological disagreements and social tensions within a changing society. The first major split occurred in 1733, when Ebenezer Erskine led the secession over the issue of patronage, the right of landowners to appoint ministers regardless of congregational wishes. The secession church itself later divided into burgher and anti-burgher factions over the legitimacy of taking civic oaths. Further fragmentation occurred with the formation of the Relief Church in 1761, again primarily over patronage issues. These divisions reflected deeper tensions between competing visions of Christian society. The moderate party, dominant within the established church after 1750, embraced Enlightenment values, literary culture, and accommodation with the landed elite. Their opponents, the evangelicals, emphasized personal conversion, strict morality, and greater congregational autonomy. This theological divide often correlated with social distinctions between urban professionals and the rural or urban working classes. Despite these divisions, religious life remained central to Scottish identity. Kirk sessions, the local church courts, continued to enforce community moral standards through public discipline for offences like fornication, drunkenness, and Sabbath breaking. The parish school system, formally established by the Education Act of 1696, promoted basic literacy with religious instruction as its core purpose. Sunday sermons provided both spiritual guidance and communal gathering points. Catholicism survived primarily in remote Highland regions and among a small number of aristocratic families. Government restrictions gradually eased after the defeat of Jacobitism, with the Catholic Relief Act of 1793 permitting public worship. Episcopalianism likewise remained marginalized until the repeal of penal laws in the 1790s, having been associated with Jacobite sympathies. Both traditions would experience revival in the 19th century through Irish immigration and aristocratic patronage, respectively. Scottish literature experienced a remarkable revival during the 18th century, though in increasingly complex linguistic forms that reflected Scotland's changing identity. Three linguistic traditions, Scots, Gaelic, and English, produced distinctive literary contributions. Alan Ramsay, 1686–1758, played a crucial role in reviving vernacular Scots poetry through works like The Gentle Shepherd, 1725, and his collection of older Scottish verse, The Ever Green, 1724. Ramsay's Edinburgh Literary Club, the Easy Club, cultivated appreciation for distinctively Scottish literary traditions while also engaging with broader British and European cultures. Robert Fergusson, 1750–1774, despite his short life, produced sophisticated poetry in both Scots and English, capturing Edinburgh's urban life and folk traditions. His works like Auld Reekie and The Daft Days influenced later poets, particularly Robert Burns, who erected a memorial at Ferguson's grave acknowledging this debt. Robert Burns, 1759–1796, emerged as Scotland's national poet, creating works in Scots, English, and a blended literary language. His poetry ranged from political radicalism, Scots Wha High, to sentimental lyrics, A Fond Kiss, and sharp social satire, Holy Willie's Prayer. Burns also collected and adapted traditional folk songs, preserving them in collections like the Scots Musical Museum. His posthumous reputation as Scotland's national bard both celebrated and limited understanding of his complex literary achievement. Gaelic literary culture, though facing increasing pressure from Anglicisation, produced significant 18th-century works. The poetry of Alasdair Mac Mahastier. Alasdair, Alexander MacDonald, combined Jacobite politics with innovative nature poetry. Women poets like Mary Nigean, Alasdair Ruaid, Mary MacLeod created memorable verse drawing on clan traditions and personal experience. However, government policies actively discouraged Gaelic usage, associating it with Jacobitism and backwardness. James Macpherson's Ossian poems, published in the 1760s, claimed to be translations of ancient Gaelic epics. Though later exposed as creative adaptations rather than authentic translations, these works profoundly influenced European Romanticism. Johann Gottfried Herder, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, and other continental intellectuals saw in Ossian an authentic voice of the people that inspired nationalist literary movements across Europe. By the century's end, writers increasingly used Standard English, though often with Scottish themes. Tobias Smollett's novels, like Humphrey Clinker, 1771, introduced Scottish characters into English fiction, while Henry Mackenzie's The Man of Feeling, 1771, exemplified the sentimental novel, popular throughout Britain. This linguistic shift reflected both commercial pressures from London publishing markets and Scotland's complex negotiation of national identity within the British Union. Scotland's educational system gained international recognition during the 18th century, though the reality was more complex than later myths suggested. The parish school system, mandated by legislation in 1696, aimed to establish a school in every parish, funded by local landowners and supervised by presbyteries. In practice, educational provision varied significantly across regions. Lowland parishes generally maintained functioning schools, but highland areas often lacked permanent facilities or Gaelic-speaking teachers. Parish schools typically taught basic literacy, religious knowledge, and sometimes rudimentary mathematics. Attendance was neither free nor compulsory, limiting access for the poorest families, and girls received less education than boys. By the century's end, approximately 80% of lowland males and 30% of females possessed basic literacy, higher than many European countries, but not the universal education suggested by later national mythology. Most pupils left school by age 8 or 9, with only a small minority receiving advanced education. The democratic intellect tradition, celebrated in later accounts, where talented poor boys supposedly advanced to university through meritocratic education, represented exceptional cases rather than normal experience. The universities underwent significant transformation during this period. Edinburgh led in medical education, establishing the world's first university clinical teaching facility at the Royal Infirmary, 1729. Glasgow pioneered experimental science teaching under figures like Joseph Black and William Cullen. Aberdeen's colleges emphasized a practical curriculum appealing to the sons of merchants and professionals. Though still primarily training ministers, lawyers, and physicians, the universities increasingly educated a commercial middle class. The distinctive feature of Scottish higher education was its emphasis on systematic knowledge rather than classical learning alone. The philosophical curriculum progressed logically, from grammar and rhetoric through moral philosophy to natural philosophy, science, providing students with methodological tools applicable across disciplines. Lecture-based instruction replaced the tutorial system of England's ancient universities, allowing larger classes and more specialized teaching. Beyond formal institutions, Scotland developed a remarkable infrastructure for adult learning. Subscription libraries appeared in provincial towns, while mechanics institutes provided technical education for artisans. Specialized societies for agriculture, medicine, and antiquities disseminated practical knowledge. This network of informal education helped integrate Enlightenment ideas into broader Scottish society. By 1800, Scotland had undergone remarkable transformation. From a poor, divided nation traumatized by famine and the Darien disaster, it had emerged as an intellectual powerhouse and developing industrial economy. The Union, despite its contentious origins, had created opportunities that energetic Scots exploited throughout Britain and its expanding empire. Yet this transformation came with significant costs and contradictions. Highland communities faced cultural and economic dislocation as commercial pressures eroded traditional social structures. Religious divisions reflected deeper social tensions within a rapidly changing society. Linguistic shifts towards Standard English represented both practical adaptation and cultural loss. The dual identity that would characterize modern Scotland emerged during this period, simultaneously North British and distinctively Scottish. As historian Christopher Smout observes, the Scots were able to feel British and Scottish at the same time, to contribute massively to the new British state and empire while maintaining their own institutions and sense of cultural distinction. This complex negotiation of multiple identities would continue to shape Scotland's development into the industrial age and beyond. Scotland in the 19th century: industry, identity, and empire. The 19th century marked one of the most dramatic transformations in Scotland's history, a period when a primarily agricultural nation evolved with remarkable speed into an industrial powerhouse. This chapter examines how Scotland emerged as one of the world's foremost centres of manufacturing, engineering, and shipbuilding, while simultaneously experiencing profound social, cultural, and political changes. The Scotland that entered the century bore little resemblance to the one that departed it. The population alone tells a compelling story. From 1,608,000 in the census of 1801, Scotland grew to 2,889,000 by mid-century and reached 4,472,000 by 1901. This demographic expansion occurred alongside an economic revolution that reshaped the Scottish landscape, both physically and metaphorically. As historian T.M. Devine notes, few European societies experienced such a comprehensive transformation in so compressed a time frame. Scotland's industrial journey began in earnest after 1790, with the western regions pioneering cotton spinning and weaving. The industry flourished for 7 decades until the American Civil War, 1861-1865, abruptly severed raw cotton supplies. Though textile manufacturing never fully recovered from this shock, it had already laid crucial foundations for Scotland's broader industrial development. James Watt's steam engine improvements and William Murdoch's innovations in gas lighting exemplified Scotland's early technical ingenuity. Their work, emerging from Scotland's Enlightenment traditions, proved instrumental to industrial advancement throughout Britain. The hot blast furnace, invented by James Beaumont Neilson in 1828, revolutionized iron smelting, making Scottish iron production significantly more efficient and cost-effective. As engineering capabilities expanded, Scotland diversified into locomotive construction and machine-making. By the 1870s, steel production had largely superseded iron manufacturing, positioning Scotland at the technological forefront of the industrial world. The railway boom transformed Scotland's economic landscape. The first successful locomotive-powered line, connecting Monkland and Kirkintilloch, opened in 1831. Railway expansion accelerated rapidly, creating an extensive network that revolutionized both passenger travel and freight transport. By 1900, Scotland boasted 3,500 miles of railway track, a remarkable density for a relatively small nation. These railways facilitated coal extraction and distribution, fueling Scotland's industrial engine. Coal mining expanded dramatically throughout the century, providing energy for factories, homes, and transport. By 1914, approximately 1 million Scots worked in coal mines, a striking proportion of the working population. Contrary to contemporary stereotypes portraying miners as socially isolated and irreligious, Scotland's mining communities developed strong cultures of solidarity, egalitarianism, and mutual support, often underpinning radical labour movements. Perhaps no industry better symbolised Scotland's industrial prowess than shipbuilding. While modest shipyards had operated since 1712, beginning with the Scott family's operation at Greenock, the industry transformed after 1860 when Clydeside Yard specialised in iron steamships, later transitioning to steel construction. The phrase "Clyde built" became synonymous with exceptional quality, and Glasgow emerged as the world's preeminent shipbuilding centre. Glasgow's ascendance was remarkable. Already one of Europe's most urbanised societies by 1800, Scotland's industrial belt stretched from southwest to northeast across the central lowlands. By 1900, 4 counties, Lanarkshire, Renfrewshire, Dunbartonshire and Ayrshire, contained 44% of Scotland's entire population. Glasgow, dubbed the second city of the empire after London, exemplified urban industrial development at its most dynamic and problematic. The pace of industrialisation created severe challenges. Housing, urban planning, and public health provisions lagged woefully behind industrial growth. Living conditions in many urban areas were notoriously poor, characterised by overcrowding, high infant mortality, and rampant tuberculosis. Historian R.J. Morris describes Glasgow's worst districts as perhaps the most densely populated urban spaces in the Western world during the mid-19th century. Some industrialists responded with paternalistic housing initiatives, offering company accommodations that represented significant improvements over inner-city slums. These efforts attracted both rural Scots and Catholic Irish immigrants to industrial centres. Many employers later supported government housing programmes and encouraged self-help projects among what they considered the respectable working class. Nevertheless, industrial Scotland's urban conditions remained a persistent challenge throughout the century. The Reform Act of 1832 marked a watershed in Scottish political life. It increased Scottish parliamentary representation and significantly broadened the franchise to include substantial portions of the middle classes. This reform precipitated a lasting shift in Scottish political alignment. From 1832 until century's end, the Whigs and later the Liberal Party dominated Scottish parliamentary representation, consistently winning the majority of Scotland's Westminster seats. Liberal ascendancy reflected Scotland's distinctive political culture, though Scottish MPs were frequently outnumbered by the larger contingent of English and Welsh Conservatives. Despite this parliamentary presence, few Scots attained the highest government offices. Lord Aberdeen, 1784–1860, educated in England rather than Scotland, led a coalition government from 1852 to 1855. But Scottish representation in cabinet remained limited. This underrepresentation contributed to growing demands for greater Scottish autonomy within the Union. By mid-century, calls for Scottish Home Rule gained momentum. The Conservative Lord Salisbury responded to these pressures in 1885 by reviving the post of Secretary of State for Scotland, which had been dormant since 1746 following the Jacobite rebellions. Salisbury appointed the Duke of Richmond, a substantial landowner with connections to both academia and local government, as Chancellor of Aberdeen University and Lord Lieutenant of Banff. The Scottish Home Rule movement drew inspiration from similar Irish campaigns, though it never achieved comparable political urgency. When Irish Home Rule divided the Liberals in 1886, a minority broke away to form the Liberal Unionists, demonstrating how constitutional questions could fracture even Scotland's dominant political tradition. Several Scots rose to political prominence during the Victorian era. William Gladstone, of Scottish descent, though born in Liverpool, served as Prime Minister 4 times between 1868 and 1894, dominating Liberal politics. The Earl of Rosebery became the first Scottish-born Liberal Prime Minister, 1894–1895. Though like Aberdeen, he was a product of England's educational system rather than Scotland's. The century's final decades witnessed the emergence of organised labour as a political force. Keir Hardie's landmark victory in the 1888 Mid-Lanarkshire by-election heralded this shift. Hardie subsequently founded the Scottish Labour Party, which merged with the Independent Labour Party in 1895, with Hardie as its first leader. This development reflected the growing political consciousness of Scotland's industrial working class and established foundations for Labour's eventual dominance in 20th-century Scottish politics. The 19th century witnessed a remarkable rehabilitation of Highland culture, a striking reversal after decades of post-Culloden suppression. Highland imagery and symbols, particularly tartan and the kilt, underwent a complex transformation from markers of dangerous Jacobite sympathies to celebrated emblems of Scottish identity. This cultural rehabilitation began with military appropriation. Highland regiments in the British Army had adopted tartan uniforms, and impoverished Highlanders enlisted in substantial numbers through the Napoleonic Wars, ending 1815. Paradoxically, while Highland soldiers wore tartan abroad, ordinary Highlanders had largely abandoned these traditional garments in everyday life. The 1820s marked a decisive shift as tartan and kilts gained popularity among social elites across Europe. This fashion emerged from the Romantic movement, stimulated by James Macpherson's controversial Ossian poems and Sir Walter Scott's wildly successful Waverley novels. Scott's orchestration of King George IV's 1822 visit to Edinburgh, the first royal visit to Scotland since 1650, proved particularly consequential. The king's appearance in tartan regalia sparked an unprecedented demand for Highland dress that overwhelmed Scotland's manufacturing capacity. The Victorian era solidified this romanticised Highland identity. Queen Victoria's affection for Scotland, culminating in her acquisition of Balmoral Castle in Aberdeenshire in 1852, gave royal imprimatur to Highland tourism and tartanry. Historians Hugh Trevor Roper and Eric Hobsbawm have compellingly demonstrated how many supposedly ancient Highland traditions, including specific clan tartans, were largely 19th-century inventions. This reimagined Highland identity enabled Scottish culture to integrate into wider European and North American contexts, particularly through tourism and emigrant communities. Yet it also imposed what historian Murray Pittock terms a sense of otherness that Scotland only began to shed in the late 20th century. The romanticised Highlands became defined largely in opposition to England and modernity, a problematic foundation for national identity. Behind the romantic facade lay stark socio-economic realities. The Highlands remained impoverished and traditional, largely disconnected from both Enlightenment influences and industrial development. A handful of powerful families, notably the Dukes of Argyll, Atholl, Buccleuch and Sutherland, controlled vast landholdings and dominated regional political, legal and economic affairs. After the Napoleonic Wars ended the wartime economic boom, 1790–1815, Highland landowners faced financial pressures. Maintaining their positions in London society required substantial income, while their traditional need for military tenants had diminished. Many landlords responded by imposing monetary rents, displacing farmers to create sheep pastures, and abandoning the patriarchal relationships that had historically bound clans together. When potato blight reached the Highlands in 1846, approximately 150,000 people faced potential starvation, as potatoes constituted their primary food source, supplemented only by herring, oatmeal and milk. Unlike in Ireland, where relief efforts failed catastrophically, Scotland implemented effective emergency measures that prevented mass starvation. Nevertheless, the crisis accelerated emigration. Landlords, charitable organizations, and government agencies provided assisted passages, enabling destitute tenants to emigrate to Canada and Australia. Over 16,000 people departed, primarily in 1851, further depopulating already vulnerable Highland communities. The 1870s brought additional economic challenges as refrigeration technology and overseas imports precipitated a collapse in sheep prices. Land values plummeted, accelerating what historians term the Balmoralisation of Scotland, the establishment of vast estates dedicated to field sports like deer stalking and grouse shooting. Named after Queen Victoria's Balmoral estate, this process transformed Highland land use. The romanticisation of the Highlands attracted wealthy industrialists and aristocrats who acquired extensive properties solely for recreational purposes. By century's end, just 118 individuals owned half of Scotland, with nearly 60% of the country incorporated into shooting estates. This extreme concentration of ownership remains controversial to this day, despite evolving recreational patterns in the 20th century. The glaring inequities in land ownership eventually catalyzed political resistance. Impoverished crofters, small-scale tenant farmers, found ideological resources in evangelical Presbyterianism, particularly after the 1843 disruption created the Free Church of Scotland. The evangelical movement's lay preachers, often from humble backgrounds themselves, offered implicit critiques of the established order that resonated powerfully with crofters' experiences. This religious consciousness helped prepare crofters for their successful challenges to landlord authority in the 1880s through the Highland Land League. Violence erupted on the Isle of Skye when landlords attempted to clear land for sheep farming and deer stalking. The government ultimately intervened with the Crofters' Holdings Scotland Act of 1886, which reduced rents, guaranteed security of tenure, and provided mechanisms to break up large estates and create crofts for dispossessed Highlanders. Political representation followed. 3 independent crofter candidates won parliamentary seats in 1885, securing explicit legal protections for Scottish smallholders, hereditary tenancy rights, and establishing a crofting commission. Though the crofters as an organised political movement declined by 1892, with most supporters shifting to the Liberal Party, their successful resistance marked a significant challenge to the prevailing economic order. Scotland's population grew steadily throughout the 19th century, from 1,600,000 in 1801 to 4,472,000 by 1901. This growth, while substantial, masked significant internal redistribution and emigration. Urbanisation accelerated dramatically as rural Scots migrated to industrial centres seeking employment. By 1900, Scotland ranked among Europe's most urbanised societies. Glasgow's explosive growth exemplified this trend, becoming one of the world's largest industrial cities. The Central Belt's industrial counties, Lanarkshire, Renfrewshire, Dunbartonshire and Ayrshire, contained nearly half the Scottish population by century's end. Despite industrial expansion, Scotland generated insufficient employment opportunities for its growing population. Between 1841 and 1931, approximately 2 million Scots emigrated to North America and Australia, with an additional 750,000 relocating to England. Scotland lost a significantly higher proportion of its population to emigration than England and Wales. As much as 30.2% of its natural population increased from the 1850s onward. This mass emigration profoundly affected Scottish society. Nearly every family lost members to emigration, and because young males emigrated disproportionately, the departures skewed Scotland's demographic profile, affecting sex ratios and age distribution. Historian Marjorie Harper characterises this as a population hemorrhage that permanently altered Scotland's demographic landscape. Scottish emigrants made remarkable contributions to their adopted countries. In the United States, prominent Scots included revolutionary cleric John Witherspoon, naval commander John Paul Jones, industrialist Andrew Carnegie, and inventor Alexander Graham Bell. Canada's development was significantly shaped by Scots like Quebec Governor James Murray, Prime Minister John A. Macdonald, and social reformer Tommy Douglas. Australia benefited from the leadership of figures like Governor Lachlan Macquarie, scientist Thomas Brisbane, and Prime Minister Andrew Fisher, while New Zealand's Scottish settlers included politician Peter Fraser. By the 21st century, Scottish-descended populations in North America would roughly equal Scotland's domestic population of 5 million. Religion remained a powerful social force in 19th-century Scotland, though the century witnessed dramatic ecclesiastical transformations. The most consequential event was undoubtedly the Great Disruption of 1843, which split the established Church of Scotland. This schism resulted from prolonged conflict over patronage, the right of landowners to appoint ministers regardless of congregational preferences. In 1834, evangelical Presbyterians gained control of the General Assembly and passed the Veto Act, allowing congregations to reject unwanted, intrusive appointments. The ensuing 10 years conflict culminated in legal defeat for the non-intrusionists in civil courts. In response, Dr. Thomas Chalmers led approximately one-third of the clergy, primarily from the North and Highlands, in forming the Free Church of Scotland. The Free Church proved especially appealing in the Highlands and Islands, where its evangelical character and greater acceptance of Gaelic language and culture resonated strongly with local communities. Chalmers articulated a compelling social vision that sought to preserve Scotland's communal traditions amid industrial disruption. He advocated for egalitarian, kirk-based, self-contained communities that balanced individual dignity with cooperative responsibility. This vision influenced even the established Church of Scotland, which had largely assimilated these ideals by the 1870s. Chalmers's approach demonstrated the Church's engagement with urban industrial problems and represented a substantive attempt to address social fragmentation. Religious divisions continued throughout the century. The late 1800s witnessed intensifying theological debates between fundamentalist Calvinists and theological liberals who rejected literal biblical interpretation. These controversies produced further fragmentation, including the 1893 formation of the Free Presbyterian Church by rigid Calvinists disaffected with the Free Church's theological direction. Countervailing movements toward reunification also emerged. The United Secession Church, formed 1820, merged with the Relief Church in 1847 to create the United Presbyterian Church, which later joined with the Free Church in 1900 to establish the United Free Church of Scotland. After the removal of patronage legislation, the majority of the Free Church would eventually rejoin the Church of Scotland in 1929. Those smaller denominations, including the Free Presbyterians and remnant Free Church, continued independently. Catholic emancipation in 1829 and substantial Irish immigration, particularly following the Irish famine, late 1840s, transformed Catholicism's position in Scotland. Irish migrants concentrated in industrial centres like Glasgow, creating significant Catholic communities in previously Protestant-dominated regions. Despite persistent anti-Catholic sentiment, a Roman Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy was restored to Scotland in 1878, establishing Catholicism as a significant Scottish denomination. Other denominations also expanded their presence. Episcopalianism revived as Jacobite associations faded, becoming formally established as the Episcopal Church in Scotland in 1804, autonomous but in communion with the Church of England. Baptist, Congregationalist and Methodist churches, present since the 18th century, experienced significant growth only in the 19th, partly because Scotland's established church and Free Presbyterian churches already incorporated many radical and evangelical elements. The Salvation Army's evangelical revivalism made inroads in urban centres after 1879, further diversifying Scotland's religious landscape. Though the Scottish Enlightenment technically concluded in the late 18th century, Scotland's intellectual contributions remained disproportionately significant for decades thereafter. Scientists and inventors like James Clerk Maxwell, Lord Kelvin, James Watt, and William Murdoch made foundational contributions to physics, mathematics, and engineering that proved essential to industrial development throughout Britain and beyond. These achievements reflected Scotland's distinctive educational traditions and institutional structures. Universities adapted to changing circumstances, gradually shifting from their traditional emphasis on broad philosophical education toward more specialized training aligned with industrial and professional requirements. Literature flourished throughout the century. Sir Walter Scott emerged as the preeminent figure in mid-century Scottish letters. Beginning as a poet and ballad collector, Scott's first prose work, Waverley, 1814, pioneered the historical novel genre and launched an extraordinarily successful literary career. Scott's historical imagination helped define and popularize Scottish cultural identity more than any other single influence. The late 19th century produced numerous internationally acclaimed Scottish authors. Robert Louis Stevenson's diverse oeuvre included the psychological exploration Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, 1886, and adventure classics like Kidnapped and Treasure Island. Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes stories established foundational conventions for detective fiction. The Kailyard tradition, literally Cabbage Patch, reintroduced fantasy and folkloric elements through writers like J.M. Barrie, creator of Peter Pan, and George MacDonald, whose work fantasies significantly influenced the nascent fantasy genre. Scotland made significant contributions to visual arts and architecture. The Glasgow School, emerging in the late 19th century and flourishing in the early 20th, synthesized diverse influences, including the Celtic Revival, arts and crafts movement, and Japanese aesthetics. This distinctive blend gained international recognition and helped define the Art Nouveau style across Europe. The movement's most prominent figures comprised the loose collective known as the Four: architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh, his wife the painter and glass artist Margaret MacDonald, her sister Frances MacDonald, and Frances's husband, artist and teacher Herbert McNair. Their innovative designs, particularly Mackintosh's architectural works like the Glasgow School of Art, represented Scotland's most significant contribution to international modernism. Traditional parish schools, long the foundation of Scottish education, faced mounting challenges from industrialisation, urbanisation, and religious disruption. Beginning in 1830, the state initiated building grants, followed by direct school funding from 1846. In 1872, Scotland implemented comprehensive reform, establishing state-sponsored, predominantly free schools administered by local school boards, broadly paralleling English developments. Overall administration rested with the Scotch, later Scottish, Education Department in London, reflecting continuing centralisation within the British system. Education became compulsory for children aged 5 to 13, spurring construction of numerous board schools. Urban school boards established higher-grade, secondary schools as more affordable alternatives to traditional burgh schools. Further reforms included the Scottish Education Department's introduction of the Leaving Certificate examination in 1888, establishing national secondary education standards, and the 1890 abolition of school fees, creating Scotland's distinctive state-funded universal education system. Scottish universities underwent parallel transformations. At the century's beginning, these institutions lacked entrance examinations. Students typically enrolled at 15 or 16, attended for as little as 2 years, selected lectures according to preference, and could depart without formal qualifications. Following investigative commissions in 1826 and 1876 and parliamentary reforms in 1858 and 1889, the curriculum and graduation systems were thoroughly restructured to address the emerging middle class's needs and professional requirements. Universities implemented entrance examinations equivalent to the school leaving certificate, average entry ages rose to 17 or 18, and standardized graduation patterns emerged: 3-year ordinary degrees and 4-year honours programs. Science faculties gained autonomy from the traditional arts curriculum's compulsory Latin, Greek, and philosophy requirements. The University of Glasgow exemplified this adaptive approach, providing education for urban and commercial classes alongside traditional elite preparation, training students for government, legal, medical, educational, ministerial careers, and increasingly for scientific and engineering professions. Women's education advanced significantly. The University of St Andrews pioneered women's admission by creating the Lady Licentiate in Arts, LLA, which proved extremely popular. From 1892, Scottish universities gained authority to admit and graduate women, whose numbers steadily increased into the early 20th century. This educational democratization, while incomplete, represented a significant advance in accessibility. The 19th century transformed Scotland from an agricultural society with notable intellectual traditions into an industrial powerhouse with global influence. This transformation entailed profound changes across every dimension of Scottish life: economic, social, political, and cultural. The Scotland that entered the century bore little resemblance to the one that departed it. Yet this transformation produced complex and contradictory legacies. Industrial prowess generated unprecedented wealth alongside urban squalor. Democratic reforms expanded political participation while leaving fundamental power structures largely intact. Highland culture underwent romantic rehabilitation, even as Highland communities experienced displacement and emigration. Religious conviction inspired both fragmentation and attempts at reunification. These 19th century developments would shape Scotland's trajectory throughout the 20th century and beyond. The industrial foundation, though it would later crumble, established patterns of settlement, work, and identity that persist in modified form. The political evolution, including Home Rule demands and Labour's emergence, prefigured Scotland's distinctive political culture. The Highland Romanticism, despite its problematic aspects, created enduring cultural symbols that continue to inform Scottish identity, both domestically and internationally. Perhaps most significantly, the 19th century cemented Scotland's paradoxical position, simultaneously integrated within British imperial structures and maintaining distinctive national institutions and identities. This duality would remain central to Scotland's modern experience, ultimately resurfacing in late 20th century debates over devolution and independence. As we shall see in subsequent chapters, Scotland's 19th century transformations cast long shadows indeed. Scotland in the early to mid-20th century. War, depression and revival. The first half of the 20th century witnessed Scotland's transformation through unprecedented challenges. From the golden age of its fishing industry to economic booms and depressions, from world wars to cultural renaissances. This period reshaped Scotland's economy, politics and society in ways that continue to resonate today. Gone was the confident industrial powerhouse of the Victorian era. In its place emerged a nation struggling with economic hardship, yet experiencing remarkable cultural revival and political realignment. The dawn of the 20th century marked what many consider the golden age of Scotland's inshore fisheries. By 1907, the Scottish herring industry produced an astonishing 2.5 million barrels of cured herring annually, employing over 35,000 people, including 14,000 women who worked as herring girls gutting and packing fish for export. Scottish catches dominated Europe's herring trade, accounting for approximately 1/3 of Britain's entire catch. This remarkable productivity stemmed largely from Scotland's early adoption of steam-powered fishing vessels, while European competitors continued to rely on less efficient sailing boats. As historian Malcolm Gray notes, the technological leap to steam power gave Scottish fishermen a decisive advantage, allowing them to venture farther offshore, extend their fishing seasons, and dramatically increase their yields. The industry created prosperity in coastal communities from Shetland to the Solway Firth. Though this golden age would eventually be disrupted by the First World War and subsequent economic turbulence, the early 20th century witnessed significant realignment in Scottish politics. The Khaki election of 1900, conducted during the Second Boer War, marked the first time the Conservative Party and their Liberal Unionist allies won a majority of Scottish parliamentary seats, reflecting the growing influence of imperial concerns and patriotic sentiment. This temporary Conservative ascendancy would soon give way to more lasting changes in Scotland's political landscape. From mid-century, the Liberal Party, long dominant in Scottish politics, began to decline as working-class voters increasingly turned to the Labour Party. Keir Hardie, a Scottish miner and trade unionist, played a crucial role in Labour's emergence, winning the Mid-Lanarkshire by-election in 1888 and later founding the Scottish Labour Party, which merged with the Independent Labour Party in 1895. Meanwhile, the Conservatives and Liberal Unionists formally merged in 1912, adopting the name Unionist Party in Scotland, a designation they would maintain until the late 20th century. Scottish political representation at Westminster included several prominent figures who rose to the highest offices. Arthur Balfour served as Conservative Prime Minister from 1902 to 1905, followed by the Liberal Henry Campbell Bannerman from 1905 to 1908. Later, Ramsay MacDonald would become Labour's first Prime Minister in 1924. Despite these individual successes, the general trend was towards Scotland's diminished influence in British governance, contributing to growing calls for Home Rule. The interwar period also saw the emergence of organised Scottish nationalism. The National Party of Scotland, founded in 1928, and the Scottish Party, established in 1930, merged in 1934 to form the Scottish National Party. While the SNP initially struggled to gain electoral traction, its formation represented a significant development in Scotland's political evolution, establishing a nationalist presence that would grow in importance during the latter half of the century. Scotland made extraordinary contributions to the British war effort during the First World War. With a population of 4.8 million in 1911, Scotland sent 690,000 men to serve, a remarkable 13% of the population. The human cost was devastating. 74,000 Scots died in combat or from disease, and 150,000 were seriously wounded. These casualties fell disproportionately on certain communities. The island of Lewis and Harris, for example, suffered some of the highest proportional losses of any part of Britain. Scottish urban centres, particularly those marked by poverty and unemployment, became favourite recruiting grounds for the British Army. Dundee, with its female-dominated jute industry limiting male employment opportunities, had one of the highest proportions of reservists and serving soldiers of any British city. Scottish troops often made up substantial portions of active combatants in major engagements, such as the Battle of Lewes, where 3 full Scottish divisions and additional Scottish units suffered catastrophic losses. Although Scots constituted roughly 10% of the British population, they ultimately accounted for approximately 20% of Britain's war dead. Scotland's industrial contribution was equally significant. The Singer Clydebank sewing machine factory, like many Scottish industrial concerns, was converted to war production, manufacturing over 303 million artillery shells, grenades, rifle parts, and other military equipment. By the war's end, women comprised approximately 70% of its 14,000-strong workforce, reflecting broader changes in gender roles and employment patterns. Clydeside shipyards and nearby engineering shops became vital centres of wartime production, though this industrial mobilisation eventually contributed to post-war labour unrest as workers demanded improved conditions and compensation. The First World War created a temporary economic boom in Scotland, with shipbuilding expanding by approximately 1/3 to meet wartime demands. However, this prosperity proved tragically short-lived. By 1922, a serious depression had descended on the Scottish economy, with particularly devastating effects on skilled craftsmen whose specialised abilities found few alternative applications in the changing economic landscape. Scotland's heavy industries, shipbuilding, coal mining, and steel production, faced sharp declines after the war due to reduced demand, loss of export markets, and increased foreign competition. By the mid-1920s, employment in shipbuilding had fallen by 90%, and over half of Scotland's iron furnaces were dismantled by 1927. As historian T.C. Smout observes, the heavy dependence on obsolescent heavy industry and mining was a central problem, and no one offered workable solutions. A few sectors did experience growth during this period. The chemicals industry expanded, and whisky production developed a global market for premium Scotch. Yet these bright spots proved insufficient to counterbalance the broader economic malaise, leading to widespread unemployment and political agitation among industrial workers. The economic deterioration led to significant social problems, including poor health, inadequate housing, and long-term mass unemployment. In many industrial regions, these conditions fueled growing radicalism, particularly evident in the Red Clydeside movement centred in Glasgow. Led by figures like John Maclean, this movement gained momentum during and after the war, characterised by strikes, protests, and demands for improved wages and working conditions. Tensions reached a peak in January 1919, when approximately 60,000 workers participated in the strike for a 40-hour workweek. Fearing revolution, the Sheriff of Lanarkshire called for military assistance, and tanks were deployed in Glasgow's George Square to disperse protesters. Though the Reds operated primarily within the Labour Party and ultimately had limited parliamentary influence, their activism represented a profound challenge to existing power structures. By the late 1920s, however, the initial revolutionary fervour had largely given way to resignation in the face of persistent unemployment. Despite industrial development, employment opportunities remained insufficient, leading to continued emigration. Between 1921 and 1931 alone, an estimated 400,000 Scots, roughly 10% of the population, left the country. During the broader period from 1841 to 1931, approximately 2 million Scots emigrated to North America and Australia, with another 750,000 relocating to England. Scotland lost a substantially higher proportion of its population to emigration than England and Wales, reaching perhaps as much as 30.2% of its natural population increase from the 1850s onward. This mass departure not only limited Scotland's population growth, but affected virtually every family, who lost members to emigration, particularly young males, skewing the country's demographic profile. The British government actively encouraged emigration through initiatives like the Empire Settlement Act of 1922, which provided financial assistance to emigrants willing to settle in Commonwealth countries. Philanthropic organizations, including the Salvation Army and various emigration associations, facilitated this movement through financial aid, employment assistance, and supervised passages. Only with the Great Depression of the 1930s did emigration numbers decline significantly, falling to fewer than 50,000 annually as economic opportunities abroad diminished, effectively ending the mass emigration pattern that had characterized Scottish life since the mid-18th century. Against this backdrop of economic hardship and social change emerged one of Scotland's most significant cultural developments, the Scottish Literary Renaissance. This movement sought to revitalize Scottish culture and literature, rejecting both English cultural dominance and the sentimental Caerliad tradition of rural Scottish life that had dominated late Victorian literature. The central figure in this renaissance was Hugh MacDiarmid, the pseudonym of Christopher Murray Grieve, whose ambitious work, A Drunk Man Looks at the Thistle, 1926, exemplified his efforts to revive Scots language as a serious literary medium. MacDiarmid developed what he called synthetic Scots, combining different regional dialects and archaic terms to create a rich literary language capable of expressing modern concepts and experiences. Other notable figures in this movement included poets Edwin Muir and William Soutar, novelists Neil Gunn, George Blake, Nan Shepherd, Lewis Grassic Gibbon, A.J. Cronin, Naomi Mitchison, and Eric Linklater, and playwright James Bridie. Born between 1887 and 1901, these writers pursued diverse creative paths, but shared a commitment to exploring Scottish identity while engaging with contemporary social and political issues. Grassic Gibbon's trilogy A Scots Quaere, 1932-1934, stands as a particular achievement, chronicling rural Scotland's transformation through richly textured language and psychological depth. This literary revival coincided with new developments in Scottish visual arts. The Glasgow School, which emerged in the late 19th century and flourished in the early 20th, synthesized influences from the Celtic Revival, arts and crafts movement, and Japanese aesthetics. The movement's most prominent figures, architect Charles Rennie Mackintosh, his wife the painter and glass artist Margaret MacDonald, her sister Frances MacDonald, and Frances's husband Herbert McNair, created distinctive works that contributed significantly to the international Art Nouveau style. Religion remained a powerful force in early 20th century Scottish life, though significant changes were underway. The Education Scotland Act of 1918 represented a watershed moment by bringing Catholic schools into the state system while allowing them to maintain their distinct religious character. This integration, while resisted by some Protestant groups, marked an important step toward religious accommodation and would significantly influence Scottish education for generations to come. Educational reforms continued throughout this period. The school leaving age was raised to 14 in 1901, and plans to increase it to 15 were approved in the Education Scotland Act of 1936, though implementation was delayed until 1947 due to the Second World War. These changes reflected growing recognition of education's importance in an increasingly complex industrial society. Scottish universities faced challenges during this period, lagging behind their English counterparts in terms of investment and participation. While the University of St Andrews pioneered women's admission through the Lady Licentiate in Arts programme, and Scottish universities gained authority to admit and graduate women from 1892, overall university attendance remained relatively low compared to England. The interwar years saw declining female enrollment due to limited professional opportunities, a trend that would only reverse in the post-war period. Scotland again played a vital role during the Second World War. Scapa Flow in Orkney served as a crucial Royal Navy base, though it suffered attacks, including the sinking of HMS Royal Oak by a German U-boat in October 1939, with the loss of 833 crew members. The shipyards and engineering factories of Glasgow and Clydeside contributed significantly to the war effort, producing vessels, weapons, and equipment, though they also endured devastating Luftwaffe bombing raids. Scotland's strategic location made it central to the Battle of the North Atlantic, while Shetland's proximity to occupied Norway enabled the Shetland Bus operation, whereby fishing boats transported Norwegian resistance fighters and refugees across the North Sea. Scottish airfields formed a complex network supporting training and operations, with squadrons along the east coast primarily engaged in coastal command duties, protecting Rosyth Dockyard and Scapa Flow. Significant individual contributions to the war effort included the invention of radar by Robert Watson Watt and the leadership of Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding at RAF Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. Scotland's agricultural sector prospered during the war, as did most industries except coal mining, which was operating increasingly exhausted mines. The more equitable distribution of food through rationing dramatically improved nutrition and health among the general population. Studies showed that the average height of 13-year-olds in Glasgow increased by 2 inches during this period. The conclusion of the Second World War gave way to new security challenges as the Cold War emerged. Scotland's strategic location ensured its continued military significance. In 1961, the United States deployed Polaris ballistic missiles and submarines at Holyloch on the Firth of Clyde, despite protests from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. This American presence would continue until 1992, when the base closed following the Cold War's end. The Royal Navy established its own nuclear submarine base at Faslane on the Gar Loch, initially operating 4 Resolution-class Polaris submarines. This facility expanded over subsequent decades, with the first patrol of a Trident-armed submarine occurring in 1994. These installations reflected Scotland's strategic importance in NATO's Cold War defence planning. Less visible but equally significant was the network of secret installations established throughout Scotland. The Anstruther bunker in Fife, constructed 40 metres underground and encased in 3-metre-thick concrete, was designed to withstand nuclear attack and would serve as a command centre in the event of war. Meanwhile, the nuclear facility at Downray in the Highlands featured among the Soviet Union's 52 known nuclear targets. These sobering reminders of Cold War realities would later raise questions about Scotland's role in Britain's nuclear deterrent strategy. By mid-century, Scotland had experienced profound transformations. Its economy had shifted away from traditional heavy industries, though without clear new directions for growth. Its politics had realigned, with Labour replacing the Liberals as the primary progressive force and nascent nationalism beginning to emerge. Its culture had experienced remarkable revival through literature and the arts, creating new expressions of Scottish identity. The wars had exacted terrible human costs, while simultaneously expanding women's roles and accelerating social change. Emigration had slowed after centuries of population loss, yet the legacy of the Scottish diaspora remained a defining feature of national consciousness. Education and religion had evolved, adapting to changing social needs while maintaining distinctive Scottish characteristics. These developments occurred within the context of Scotland's complex relationship with the United Kingdom, simultaneously integrated within British imperial structures, yet maintaining distinctive national institutions and identities. This duality would become increasingly significant in the second half of the 20th century as Scotland navigated post-imperial transitions and new questions of governance, economy, and identity. Post-war Scotland. From industrial decline to devolution. The Second World War marked a turning point in Scottish history. The following decades witnessed profound transformations in virtually every aspect of Scottish life: economic, political, social, and cultural. Scotland's traditional industries declined amid growing international competition, while the discovery of North Sea oil promised new economic possibilities. Political loyalties shifted dramatically as Labour's dominance gave way to multi-party competition and rising nationalism. The establishment of a devolved Scottish Parliament in 1999 represented the most significant constitutional change since the 1707 Union. Meanwhile, Scottish culture experienced remarkable revival and reinvention across literature, arts, and education. This chapter examines Scotland's journey from post-war industrial nation to devolved political entity. charting both the challenges and achievements of this transformative period. In the immediate post-war years, Scotland's economy benefited from the modernisation and reconstruction efforts that characterised Britain's recovery. However, by the 1950s, serious structural weaknesses had become apparent. Scotland's over-reliance on traditional heavy industries, shipbuilding, coal mining, steel production and heavy engineering, left it vulnerable as international competition intensified. These industries had been declining since the interwar period, but the process accelerated dramatically in the post-war decades. Shipbuilding provides a stark illustration of this decline. Once Scotland's industrial crown jewel, with Clydeside producing approximately one-fifth of the world's ships in the early 20th century, the industry faced catastrophic contraction. Between 1955 and 1969, employment in Scottish shipbuilding fell from 57,000 to 33,000 workers and continued to plummet thereafter. Similarly, coal mining employment fell from 82,000 in 1951 to approximately 4,000 by the mid-1980s, as older, less efficient mines closed and the industry consolidated. Various factors contributed to this industrial collapse, including aging infrastructure, outdated manufacturing methods, poor labor relations, increasing foreign competition, particularly from Japan and later South Korea, and government policies that prioritized financial services over manufacturing. Christopher Harvey describes the result as deindustrialization on a massive and unprecedented scale, noting that between 1976 and 1987, Scotland lost approximately 11% of its total employment and nearly 31% of its manufacturing jobs. These economic transformations had profound social consequences. Unemployment rates in Scotland consistently exceeded the UK average, reaching particularly high levels during the 1980s, when many industrial centres experienced rates above 20%. The decline of traditional industries also undermined the social fabric of many communities, as generations of shared occupational identity and solidarity dissolved. The discovery of substantial oil and gas reserves in the North Sea during the 1970s promised a potential economic lifeline. The first major discovery came in October 1970, when British Petroleum found the giant Forties field approximately 110 miles east of Aberdeen. The following year, Shell discovered the massive Brent field east of Shetland. Production began from the Argyle field in June 1975, with Forties following that November. The development of North Sea oil created an economic boom in northeast Scotland, particularly around Aberdeen, which transformed from a declining fishing port into Europe's oil capital. By the 1980s, the offshore industry supported approximately 100,000 jobs in Scotland, with tens of thousands more in related services. The Scottish ports of Aberdeen, Peterhead and Montrose served as supply bases, while fabrication yards at Nigg, Ardersier and Methyll constructed massive steel platforms. However, the economic benefits of North Sea oil proved unevenly distributed. While Aberdeen and its surrounding region prospered, other parts of Scotland continued to suffer from industrial decline. Moreover, the question of who should benefit from this natural resource became politically contentious. The Scottish National Party's famous slogan, "It's Scotland's oil," powerfully articulated the nationalist argument that oil revenues should primarily benefit Scotland rather than the UK Treasury. As historian Christopher Harvey argues, North Sea oil represented not just economic opportunity, but a profound political challenge, forcing Scots to reconsider fundamental questions about national resources, sovereignty, and identity. As traditional industries contracted, Scotland gradually developed a more diverse, service-oriented economy. Financial services expanded significantly, building on Edinburgh's long-established banking sector, with the city becoming Britain's second-largest financial centre after London. By the early 21st century, financial services employed approximately 95,000 people in Scotland and accounted for around 8% of Scottish GDP. Tourism also grew substantially, capitalising on Scotland's natural landscapes, historic sites, and cultural heritage. The industry expanded beyond the traditional Edinburgh Highlands circuit to encompass a wider range of attractions and experiences throughout the country. By 2019, tourism contributed approximately $12 billion annually to the Scottish economy and supported around 218,000 jobs. The electronics sector emerged as another growth area during the 1980s and 1990s. American and Asian companies established manufacturing facilities in central Scotland, creating a corridor of high-tech industries that became known as Silicon Glen. At its peak in the late 1990s, Silicon Glen produced approximately 28% of Europe's PCs, 60% of its workstations, and 85% of its ATMs. However, this sector proved vulnerable to global economic shifts, experiencing significant contractions as manufacturing increasingly moved to Asia in the early 21st century. Scotland's public sector also expanded substantially during this period, becoming a crucial source of relatively secure employment as private industry contracted. By the early 21st century, public administration, education, and health services accounted for approximately one-third of Scottish employment, significantly higher than the UK average. While these developments created new economic opportunities, they failed to fully compensate for the loss of industrial jobs. Moreover, the transition produced profound spatial inequalities, with prosperous areas, particularly in Edinburgh and Aberdeen, contrasting sharply with struggling former industrial regions. As Tom Devine observes, post-industrial Scotland resembled a patchwork quilt of prosperity and deprivation, rather than the more uniformly prosperous industrial nation of the past. The immediate post-war period witnessed Labour's emergence as Scotland's dominant political force. In the 1945 general election, Labour won 37 of Scotland's 71 parliamentary seats, establishing a pattern of electoral success that would persist for decades. Between 1945 and 1997, Labour consistently secured the largest share of Scottish Westminster seats, with particularly strong performances in the industrialised Central Belt. This electoral dominance reflected Labour's strong connections with Scotland's industrial working class and trade union movement, as well as its commitment to the welfare state established after the war. As historian Richard Finlay notes, for many Scots, Labour represented both class solidarity and national identity, a distinctively Scottish commitment to collective welfare and social justice. The importance of Scottish votes to Labour's overall UK performance cannot be overstated. Without Scottish MPs, Labour would have won only 2 UK general elections during the 20th century, 1945 and 1966, highlighting Scotland's crucial role in sustaining the party nationally. Several prominent Labour politicians with Scottish connections achieved high office during this period, including Hugh Gaitskell, whose mother was Scottish, Harold Wilson, who studied at Edinburgh University, and John Smith, born in Argyllshire, who led the party from 1992 until his death in 1994. The post-war period witnessed a gradual but relentless decline in Conservative electoral fortunes in Scotland. Although the party, known as the Unionist Party in Scotland until 1965, performed strongly in the 1950s, winning a majority of Scottish seats in the 1955 general election, its support began to erode thereafter. The Conservatives fell from 36 Scottish seats in 1955 to 22 in 1979, 10 in 1987, and finally to 0 in 1997. A nadir memorably described as the Night of the Long Sgian Doobs, referring to the traditional Scottish dagger. Various factors contributed to this decline, including the contraction of Scotland's middle class as traditional industries collapsed, the association of conservatism with English interests, and the party's increasingly centralised policy agenda under Margaret Thatcher. The introduction of the community charge, widely known as the poll tax, in Scotland in 1989, a year before its implementation in England and Wales, proved particularly damaging. As David McCrone argues, the poll tax became a potent symbol of an alien political agenda imposed on Scotland against its will, reinforcing perceptions of a democratic deficit. Scottish politics thus developed an increasingly distinctive character, with the Conservatives becoming a marginal force despite their continuing strength in England. This electoral divergence contributed significantly to growing demands for constitutional change, as Scotland regularly found itself governed by a party it had comprehensively rejected at the ballot box. The Scottish National Party, founded in 1934 through the merger of the National Party of Scotland and the Scottish Party, achieved its first parliamentary breakthrough when Robert McIntyre won the Motherwell by-election in April 1945. Though he lost the seat in the general election 3 months later, This victory demonstrated nationalism's potential electoral appeal. The SNP remained a marginal force until the 1960s, when changing economic conditions and cultural shifts created more fertile ground for nationalist politics. The party won its second parliamentary seat when Winnie Ewing captured Hamilton, a Labour stronghold, in a 1967 by-election, declaring memorably that "Stop the world, Scotland wants to get on." This victory signalled nationalism's growing appeal beyond traditional Highland constituencies to industrial regions previously dominated by Labour. The SNP achieved its electoral breakthrough in the February 1974 general election, winning 7 seats and 22% of the Scottish vote, followed by 11 seats in the October election that same year. The party's success owed much to its Scotland's Oil campaign, which effectively argued that Scotland should benefit directly from North Sea resources rather than seeing them controlled by Westminster. Although the SNP experienced electoral setbacks in the 1980s, falling back to just 2 MPs, it gradually rebuilt its support during the 1990s. Under the leadership of Alex Salmond, the party professionalized its organization and moderated its policy platform, adopting the concept of independence in Europe to reassure voters concerned about isolation. These changes positioned the SNP to benefit from the introduction of devolution and proportional representation, allowing it eventually to supplant Labour as Scotland's dominant political force. The question of Scottish self-government has deep historical roots, dating back to Home Rule campaigns in the 19th century. However, the movement gained significant momentum in the post-war period, as Scotland's economic and political divergence from England became increasingly apparent. The discovery of North Sea oil in the early 1970s intensified debates about Scotland's constitutional status, as it appeared to make independence economically viable. Rising nationalist sentiment, coupled with Labour's concern about losing support to the SNP, led the 1974-1979 Labour government, under Harold Wilson and then James Callaghan, to propose devolution for Scotland. The resulting Scotland Act 1978 proposed creating a Scottish Assembly with limited powers, subject to approval by referendum. When the referendum was held on 1 March 1979, 51.6% voted in favour, with 48.4% against. However, a controversial amendment introduced by Labour MP George Cunningham required support from at least 40% of the entire electorate, not just a simple majority of those voting. With turnout at 63.8%, the yes vote represented only 32.9% of the electorate, falling short of the required threshold. The failure of the 1979 referendum, followed shortly thereafter by Margaret Thatcher's election as Prime Minister, appeared to end prospects for constitutional change. However, Thatcher's policies, particularly industrial closures, privatisation and the poll tax, galvanised opposition and strengthened perceptions of a democratic deficit. This sentiment found expression in the 1988 Claim of Right for Scotland, signed by a range of political, civic and religious leaders, which asserted the Scottish people's right to determine their own constitutional arrangements. The campaign for a Scottish Assembly, later renamed the Scottish Constitutional Convention, brought together Labour, Liberal Democrats, churches, trade unions, and civic organisations to develop detailed proposals for a devolved parliament. Though the SNP and Conservatives did not participate, the convention created a broad consensus around key principles, including proportional representation and measures to ensure gender balance. Labour's landslide victory in the 1997 UK general election, under the leadership of Tony Blair, created the political conditions for constitutional change. The new government quickly moved to hold referendums on devolution in Scotland and Wales. On 11 September 1997, symbolically the 700th anniversary of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, Scottish voters decisively approved the creation of a parliament with tax-varying powers, with 74.3% supporting a parliament and 63.5% endorsing tax powers. The resulting Scotland Act 1998 established the Scottish Parliament with 129 members elected through a mixed electoral system, combining constituency representation with proportional elements. The Parliament received powers over health, education, local government, economic development, and criminal justice, while Westminster retained authority over defence, foreign affairs, and macroeconomic policy, a division characterised as reserved and devolved matters. The Scottish Parliament officially opened on 1 July 1999, with Donald Dewar, widely regarded as the father of devolution, serving as First Minister until his sudden death in October 2000. Initially operating from temporary accommodation, the Parliament moved to its controversial new building at Holyrood in 2004. Designed by Spanish architect Enric Miralles, the building exceeded its original budget by approximately 10 times, eventually costing $414 million, a contentious start for the new institution. The first two Scottish administrations consisted of Labour-Liberal-Democrat coalitions, initially led by Donald Dewar, then by Henry MacLeish and Jack McConnell. These governments introduced distinctive Scottish policies, including free personal care for the elderly, the abolition of university tuition fees, and land reform legislation that expanded community ownership rights. The 2007 Scottish Parliament election marked a watershed, with the SNP winning a narrow plurality of seats, 47 out of 129, and forming a minority government under Alex Salmond. Although lacking an overall majority, the SNP demonstrated effective governance, implementing popular policies such as ending prescription charges and maintaining free university education. The SNP's electoral breakthrough came in the 2011 Scottish Parliament election, when it secured an absolute majority, a remarkable achievement in a system designed to prevent single-party dominance. This majority provided the political mandate for a referendum on Scottish independence, which was negotiated with the UK government and scheduled for September 2014. The independence referendum campaign mobilised unprecedented political engagement, with a record 84.6% voter turnout. Although the proposition was ultimately rejected by 55.3% to 44.7%, the campaign transformed Scottish politics, energising a new generation of politically active citizens and strengthening the SNP's position despite the referendum loss. This was dramatically demonstrated in the 2015 UK general election, when the SNP won 56 of Scotland's 59 Westminster seats, virtually eliminating Labour's Scottish representation and establishing itself as the third largest party in the UK Parliament. The 2016 Brexit referendum created new constitutional tensions, as Scotland voted decisively to remain in the European Union. 62% remain, 38% leave, while the UK as a whole narrowly voted to leave. This divergence intensified debates about Scotland's constitutional future and provided the SNP with grounds to argue for a second independence referendum, a request consistently rejected by the UK government under both Theresa May and Boris Johnson. Post-war Scotland witnessed significant religious changes, most notably a steady decline in church attendance and religious observance. The Church of Scotland, historically the national church, experienced a steady erosion of membership, falling from approximately 1.3 million in 1956 to around 325,000 by 2018, representing a decline from about 25% of the population to less than 6%. The Roman Catholic Church maintained greater stability, with approximately 667,000 adherents by 2011, though it too faced declining attendance, particularly among younger generations. Various factors contributed to this secularization, including increasing affluence, expanding educational opportunities, growing individualism, and the development of alternative leisure activities. As sociologist Steve Bruce argues, secularization in Scotland followed a similar pattern to other Western European societies, though with some distinctively Scottish characteristics reflecting the nation's particular religious history. Alongside declining adherence to traditional Christian denominations, Scotland also experienced growing religious diversity. The 2011 census recorded significant Muslim, 76,737, Hindu, 16,379, Sikh, 9,055, and Buddhist, 12,795 communities, reflecting both post-war immigration and conversion. Muslims formed the largest non-Christian religious group, with substantial communities in Glasgow, Edinburgh, and Dundee. Perhaps most striking was the growth of non-religious identification. The 2011 census found that 36.7% of Scots claimed no religious affiliation, rising from 27.8% in 2001. This trend was particularly pronounced among younger generations, with approximately 60% of Scots under 35 identifying as non-religious by 2011. Organizations promoting secularism and humanism gained increasing influence, advocating for the removal of religious privilege from public institutions, particularly in education. Despite these changes, religious institutions continue to exert significant influence in Scottish public life, with both the Church of Scotland and Roman Catholic Church maintaining strong voices in debates about social issues, welfare, and education. Religious divisions also persisted in certain aspects of Scottish life, most visibly in football rivalries between predominantly Catholic Celtic and historically Protestant Rangers, though these sectarian associations gradually diminished over time. Scotland's population remained relatively stable during the post-war period, growing modestly from 5.1 million in 1951 to approximately 5.4 million by 2018. This stability masked significant demographic changes, including aging, urbanization, and increasing ethnic diversity. The post-war period initially saw substantial internal migration from rural areas to cities, continuing earlier urbanization trends. However, from the 1960s onward, counter-urbanization emerged as middle-class Scots moved from city centres to suburbs and commuter towns. Glasgow's population fell dramatically, from over 1.1 million in 1951 to approximately 600,000 by the early 21st century, though the broader metropolitan area maintained its prominence. International migration patterns also changed significantly. While Scotland had historically been characterized by net emigration, the late 20th century saw increasing immigration, particularly following European Union expansion in 2004. By 2011, approximately 7% of Scotland's population was born outside the UK, with significant Polish, Indian, Pakistani, Chinese, and Irish communities. Housing conditions improved substantially during this period, though significant challenges persisted. The massive public housing programs of the post-war decades addressed the worst slum conditions, but created new problems through poor construction, inadequate maintenance, and social segregation. The right-to-buy policy, introduced by Margaret Thatcher's government in 1980, transformed housing tenure patterns, with owner occupation increasing from approximately 35% in 1980 to around 65% by the early 21st century. Health indicators improved markedly, with life expectancy increasing from 64.4 years for men and 68.7 for women in 1951 to 77.1 and 81.1 respectively by 2017. However, significant health inequalities persisted, with Glasgow in particular continuing to exhibit higher rates of heart disease, cancer, and alcohol-related illness than comparable European cities, a phenomenon sometimes termed the Glasgow effect. Family structures underwent profound transformation, with marriage rates declining, divorce increasing following the liberalization of divorce law in 1976, and non-traditional family forms becoming more common. By 2018, approximately 51% of children in Scotland were born outside marriage, compared to just 8% in 1971, reflecting changing social attitudes rather than material deprivation. The post-war period witnessed significant changes in Scottish education, which maintained its distinctive characteristics despite increasing alignment with broader UK systems. The raising of the school-leaving age to 15 in 1947 and then to 16 in 1973 extended educational opportunity, though challenges remained in ensuring quality education for all social groups. The comprehensive reorganisation of secondary education, implemented from the mid-1960s onward, represented a particularly significant reform. Scotland adopted comprehensive education more smoothly than England, partly because the senior secondary schools established under the 1936 Education Scotland Act had already created more egalitarian structures than the English grammar school system. By the early 1970s, almost all Scottish secondary students attended non-selective comprehensive schools, though significant differences in culture and achievement remained between schools serving different social constituencies. Curricular reforms also transformed Scottish education. The introduction of standard grade in the 1980s replacing the former ordinary grade examinations, aimed to provide appropriate certification for all students, rather than just the academic elite. This was followed by higher still reforms in the 1990s, which created a unified system of national qualifications. The Curriculum for Excellence, developed during the early 2000s and implemented from 2010, represented the most ambitious reform, moving away from rigid subject divisions toward more integrated approaches, emphasizing capacities and skills as well as knowledge. The administration of Scottish education was also transformed. The 1996 local government reorganisation replaced the previous regional system with 32 unitary authorities, creating challenges for the coordination of educational services. After devolution, successive Scottish governments exercised increasing central direction over education, though stopping short of the market-oriented reforms introduced in England. Scotland's ancient universities, St Andrews, Glasgow, Aberdeen and Edinburgh, were joined by new institutions in the post-war period, significantly expanding higher education provision. The University of Dundee gained independence from St Andrews in 1967, while new universities were established at Stirling, 1967, and Heriot-Watt in Edinburgh, 1966. Further expansion occurred in the 1990s when former polytechnics and colleges gained university status, including Glasgow Caledonian, Napier in Edinburgh, Robert Gordon in Aberdeen, Abertay in Dundee, and Paisley, later the University of the West of Scotland. This expansion dramatically increased participation in higher education. By the early 21st century, approximately 40% of young Scots entered higher education, compared to less than 5% in the immediate post-war period. However, significant social inequalities persisted, with students from more affluent backgrounds still substantially overrepresented, particularly at the most prestigious institutions. Scottish higher education maintained distinctive features, including 4-year undergraduate degrees, a broader first-year curriculum, and an emphasis on professionalism. After devolution, a significant policy divergence emerged when the Scottish government abolished tuition fees for Scottish students attending Scottish institutions, while students from the rest of the UK continued to pay fees. This policy reflected Scotland's more collectivist political tradition, though it created complicated cross-border arrangements within the UK higher education system. Research excellence remained a priority, with Scottish universities consistently performing strongly in international rankings. Particular strengths emerged in areas including life sciences, informatics, and renewable energy. However, challenges included increasing competition for research funding, growing international competition, and concerns about the balance between teaching and research responsibilities. The Scottish literary renaissance that began in the interwar period continued to flourish after 1945, with poets including Sidney Goodser Smith, Robert Garriock, and Norman MacCaig developing distinctive voices. Edwin Morgan emerged as a particularly influential figure, producing innovative poetry that engaged with urban life, scientific developments, and international perspectives while maintaining deep connections to Scottish contexts. His appointment as the First Scots Macar, national poet, in 2004 recognised his cultural significance. George Mackay-Brown from Orkney and Ian Crichton-Smith from Lewis created distinctive bodies of work influenced by their island backgrounds, often exploring the tension between traditional communities and modernising forces. Both wrote in multiple genres, including poetry, fiction, drama, and essays, demonstrating the versatility characteristic of many Scottish writers. Scottish fiction underwent significant transformation during this period. While earlier 20th century novelists often left Scotland to pursue literary careers, a new generation remained in Scotland while achieving international recognition. James Kelman's uncompromising depictions of working-class Glasgow life, using authentic speech patterns and challenging conventional literary forms, culminated in the controversial Booker Prize win for How Late It Was, How Late, 1994. Alasdair Gray's experimental novel Lanark, 1981, combined realistic depictions of mid-20th century Glasgow with fantastical elements, creating what many consider the definitive fictional exploration of modern Scotland's industrial and post-industrial experience. Women writers achieved increasing prominence, particularly from the 1980s onward. Muriel Spark, though primarily based outside Scotland, created internationally acclaimed fiction including The Prime of Miss Jean Brodie, 1961, which drew on her Edinburgh background. Later writers, including Janice Galloway, A.L. Kennedy, and Ali Smith, developed distinctive literary voices addressing feminist concerns while avoiding simple categorization. The 1990s witnessed a particular literary flowering, with Irvine Welsh's Trainspotting, 1993, achieving international success through its raw depiction of Edinburgh drug culture, later adapted into a globally successful film by Danny Boyle. The emergence of Scottish crime fiction as a distinctive genre, particularly through the work of Ian Rankin and his Edinburgh detective Inspector Rebus, created another internationally recognized literary brand. Carol Ann Duffy, born in Glasgow, though largely raised in England, became the first woman, First Scot, and first openly LGBT person to be appointed UK Poet Laureate in 2009, reflecting the increasing prominence of Scottish voices in British literary culture. Although working primarily within English literary traditions, Duffy's work often referenced her Scottish background and working-class origins. Scottish visual arts developed distinctive characteristics during this period, often exploring questions of identity, landscape, and social experience. The Glasgow School of Art maintained its significance as a creative centre, producing influential artists including Joan Erdley, whose powerful depictions of Glasgow tenement children and the Aberdeenshire landscape created a distinctive vision before her early death in 1963. The Glasgow miracle of the 1980s and 1990s saw the city emerge as an internationally significant centre for contemporary art, with artists including Douglas Gordon, Christine Borland, and Simon Starling achieving global recognition. The establishment of the Gallery of Modern Art in Glasgow, 1996, and the opening of Dundee Contemporary Arts, 1999, reflected growing institutional support for contemporary visual practice. Scottish music encompassed diverse traditions during this period. Folk music experienced significant revival, with performers including Hamish Henderson, Jean Redpath, and later Dick Gowan maintaining traditional repertoires while developing contemporary approaches. The establishment of the Traditional Music and Song Association in 1966 and Celtic Connections Festival in 1994 institutionalized this revival. Popular music also flourished, with bands including Simple Minds, Deacon Blue, and The Proclaimers achieving international success while maintaining distinctive Scottish identities. The emergence of indie labels, such as Postcard Records in the early 1980s, created infrastructure for alternative music, leading to the development of influential bands including Orange Juice, Aztec Camera, and later Belle and Sebastian. Theatre underwent significant development, particularly following the establishment of the Scottish Theatre Company in 1981. Though financial constraints led to its closure just a few years later, the opening of the new Royal Lyceum Theatre in Edinburgh, 1969, and the establishment of the Traverse Theatre as a centre for new writing created important institutional foundations. Playwrights including John Byrne, Liz Lochhead, and David Greig developed distinctively Scottish theatrical voices, while companies such as Wildcat specialised in political theatre addressing contemporary social issues. The establishment of Scottish Opera, 1962, and Scottish Ballet, 1969, expanded Scotland's cultural infrastructure. Though both organisations faced recurrent funding challenges, the Edinburgh International Festival, established in 1947, continued to develop as a globally significant cultural event, complemented by the increasingly important Fringe Festival, which by the early 21st century had become the world's largest arts festival. By the early 21st century, Scotland had undergone profound transformations across every dimension of national life. The industrial economy that had shaped modern Scotland largely disappeared, replaced by a more diverse but often more precarious service economy. Traditional social structures and religious affiliations weakened, while new forms of identity and community emerged. Political nationalism gained unprecedented strength, achieving the establishment of a devolved parliament and bringing the possibility of independence firmly into mainstream political debate. Throughout these changes, certain continuities remained. Scotland's distinctive educational traditions persisted despite reform and expansion. Cultural identities evolved, but maintained recognizable connections to historical antecedents. Social values continued to reflect commitments to collective welfare and relative egalitarianism, even as economic changes increased certain inequalities. The devolution era demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of Scotland's constitutional arrangements. The Scottish Parliament allowed for distinctive policy approaches in areas including education, health and social welfare, but remained constrained by limited fiscal powers and the realities of economic interdependence. The independence referendum of 2014, while resulting in a vote to remain within the United Kingdom, demonstrated the extent to which questions of national identity and constitutional futures had moved to the centre of Scottish political life. As the early 21st century progressed, Scotland faced significant challenges, adapting to climate change, managing the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, addressing persistent social inequalities, and navigating an increasingly complex international environment. The constitutional question remained unresolved, with Brexit creating new tensions in the relationship between Scotland and the wider United Kingdom. Yet Scotland also possessed significant strengths: well-developed civic institutions, internationally recognized universities, creative cultural industries, and natural resources including renewable energy potential. The transformation from industrial nation to devolved polity had been neither smooth nor complete, but it had demonstrated the resilience and adaptability of Scottish society. As Scotland faced an uncertain future, it did so with both the burden and the benefit of a complex history. A small nation that had repeatedly reinvented itself while maintaining distinctive identities and institutions.